Welcome to the Bioethics Babe podcast, where we examine the tough questions in human flourishing in light of science, faith, and culture. I'm your host, Arina Grosso-Agnew. Now let's dive in. Euthanasia and assisted suicide are often framed as acts of compassion, about choice, autonomy, dignity, and the relief from suffering. But what happens when those promises collide with real people, real pressures, and real power imbalances inside modern healthcare systems? My guest today has spent decades, actually since 1999, tracking exactly that question. Alex Schadenberg is the executive director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition and one of the most knowledgeable voices in the world on euthanasia and assisted suicide. From Canada's rapidly expanding MAiD regime to disturbing cases involving people euthanized without true consent, to what we can learn from Europe, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States, Alex has been documenting the human cost long before most people were paying attention. In this conversation, we talk about how safeguards fail, who is most at risk, and why the so-called slippery slope is no longer theoretical, but measurable. This is a difficult conversation, but it's a necessary one. Alex, welcome to Bioethics Babe.
Thank you, Arina. This is a very difficult topic. I'm glad you introduced it that way. And it is very necessary to talk about it because most people remain sort of in the dark as to exactly what is happening. And it's important to expose the light to it.
And we're so grateful to have you to do just that. Before we get into the policy and specific cases, tell us about your background. How did you come to lead the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, and what first drew you to this issue?
So I was first actually drawn to this issue in the 1990s because in Canada, we had a case of Robert Latimer, a farmer, who had killed his daughter, Tracy. And Tracy had cerebral palsy. And that case ended up going through the courts, and he was arguing that this was a force majeure, meaning that he had no choice because of her condition. He had to kill her, and the media was presenting him as this caring, loving father who was this salt of the earth man who, this is terrible what happened to him. And there was a poll done in Canada, and it showed that like 32% of Canadians thought that what Robert Latimer did was just fine. And you may say, well, what's that got to do with you, Alex? Well, my wife and I had a son who was autistic. Now, autism is not the same as cerebral palsy at all, I know, but we were getting involved in the autism community. And so there's lots of issues you could focus on in life, but this issue hit home because we started thinking, yes, the disability community is right. There is a clear difference in attitudes. And if you're to legalize euthanasia, how would that affect people in that group of people? So anyway, this is what got me rolling in this. Obviously, the issue of euthanasia wasn't really ready to be legalized in Canada per se. There was no political party really pushing it at that point. Nonetheless, we were having this discussion in a way that was causing incredible concern to me.
Yeah, and you stayed in this work for decades. What have you seen change, not just legally, but culturally, in how societies talk about suffering, death, and dependency?
A very interesting question, especially since when I first got started, people thought, Alex, this is never going to happen. They would say, well, we know that there had been euthanasia going on in the Netherlands. I can give you a very quick little underbelly of it, but in fact, euthanasia sort of became legal in the Netherlands in the 1970s through a court decision, but it never really was legalized until 2002. But people were saying, well, this was never going to happen, Alex, and I was talking about it because I realized that the culture was sort of building towards that, this culture of certain lives are not worth living, living in a certain state, you're better off dead. These sort of concepts were becoming popular. And so we were seeing this shift. And if you consider the radical secularization that's happened since that point, I remember I was a young guy talking about this stuff. I'm still not ancient, but I'm getting there. But the point of it is that this radical secularization really fed into this concept. So what we've seen is a real change in medical ethics. So I'll give you a prime example. The concept actually of actually even providing medical treatment for someone in a significant condition. Let's say someone had a motorcycle accident and they had some serious injuries. the concept now of actually treating them is now negotiated, whereas back 30 years ago, you would have never looked at that way. You wouldn't consider it. You would say, well, we'll see what we can do for them, and maybe, yes, maybe they're going to die, but there was no, Arena, your quality of life for your son is not going to be very good. So therefore, really, should we be doing anything for them? Now, I do understand there's obviously times when, we allow someone to die simply because there is really no other outcome of the situation. But I mean, the culture shifted so much. And now the concept is not only in my country, especially in Canada, not only when you come into these situations are they now talking about euthanasia, which we call MAiD in Canada. MAiD is a made in Canada term. They call it MAiD to make you feel better about killing. Not only are they talking about it, but that becomes now really the true option. And then there's the now becoming almost confusion when someone's saying, no, I wouldn't want that. So really, it's really quite a radical shift we've seen, and it's really more comparable to the concept of the frog in the cold water that you're heating up, and over time, of course, the water boils. It's getting pretty close to a boiling point if we're not there already in my own country, and you're facing that in the U.S. too, and we can talk about that in a minute.
And I think this is why it's such an important discussion to have. So, for clarity, can you explain the difference between euthanasia and assisted suicide and why that distinction matters ethically and legally?
That's very important because a lot of people get confused about them. So the fact of it is that when we're talking about euthanasia, we're talking about a doctor. In my country, it's doctors and nurse practitioners that are allowed to be involved with killing you. But we're talking about them actually killing you. So they're poisoning you to death is really what's happening. If you consider how the drug, the lethal drug concoction is working, they're actually poisoning you to death. That's what they're doing. And in euthanasia is when the doctor or the nurse practitioner does the act. They usually would hook you up they hook you up by the tube, and then they use a plunger to have it go through quickly into your system, and they kill you. So they can do it also by lethal injection, depending on their situation and when they're doing it and how they're doing it. Whereas assisted suicide is using the same lethal poison drug concoction. It's the same idea, but they're doing it in a soluble manners because they're making it in such a way that that mixture is then put into a drink, and then you would drink it down, and it would kill you in the same way. So the difference between the two is both are poisoning you to death. Both have the same intention, that you be dead. Both are requiring doctors who are saying, yes, your life isn't worth living, so I'll help kill you. The difference is how it's carried out. Euthanasia would be the doctor or the nurse practitioner doing the act, so it's homicide. And assisted suicide is when you are given those lethal same drugs, but you have to do it in the end yourself. The difference is, in fact, sort of minor in a sense, but it is who carries out the act.
Right. And also with assisted suicide, you may have gotten the concoction, but just decided not to do it, and someone slips it into your drink. Maybe it's someone who wants your inheritance,
Well,
or it could be that someone that you're not ready to kill yourself, but someone decides that they're going to do it anyway since the drugs are sitting around.
right. And I do like using the term poison simply because it defines both accurately. They're a poison to death either way. Now, in the case of assisted suicide, yes, since the law, we haven't gotten into that yet. Maybe we should back it off. But once you receive the lethal concoction in every single state in the US where it's been legal, so there's now 13 states where it's legal, there is no oversight of the law. So the blurring of euthanasia and assisted suicide becomes very clear when there's no technical oversight. How did they actually die? We don't know. We know that they received a lethal concoction. We know they died, and we know the concoction was used. But that's all we know.
Right. And we're going to get into the US. But first, I wanted to just ask you at a human dignity level, why are euthanasia and assisted suicide wrong? And what are the core moral principles at stake?
Well, I think that's an excellent way to look at it, Irina. Why is this wrong? And I think we should try and keep that simple because a lot of people go into issues as to, we should be providing care. Of course, we should be providing care for people. We should be providing better care for people. Yes. We should ensure that pain and symptom management is always available to people. I agree. There's no question about that. But this is actually about killing somebody. And I think we have to be very clear about that, whether it is the doctor or nurse doing it to you or you receiving it and in the end taking it yourself, somebody's actually involved directly in killing you. And I don't ever think that's an acceptable action that someone kills you. And I don't think you should ever feel safe in a culture or in a country or in a state that allows doctors or nurses to be involved with killing you, because you're assuming right off the bat that this is all about your freedom, choice, and autonomy, which I'm going to get into in a minute, which is a lie. But really, you're giving someone the right and law to kill you. I don't believe in killing people, Arena. And you could say, oh, maybe that comes from a religious argument. You don't have to be religious to believe it's just simply wrong to have people involved with killing you. And that's what it is. I think we should just really keep it simple. And people say, well, they accuse me of being wanting people to suffer. I don't want anybody to suffer. I want them to be cared for. I have no interest in seeing you suffering. My interest is that we don't kill you.
Absolutely. And that's completely right, because you can take drugs for pain management and they may even hasten death, but they're for pain management.
Correct.
But it's
Yeah.
a different story when you're given poisonous substances to kill you with a direct intention to kill you. So I completely agree with you. There's a
I
distinction between drugs to help with pain management and drugs that are intended to actually take your life.
So I think it's a very important point you made, because you're talking about the difference between the intention. And I think that's fundamental. In Canada, we had a Supreme Court decision that led to the legalization of euthanasia in Canada, the Carter decision. And our Supreme Court decided that there was no difference between killing and letting die. Now, first of all, what is the Supreme Court deciding on that anyway? That's a philosophical argument. And it's obvious that the Supreme Court were not, experts in philosophy, because they think they could declare a philosophical end to an argument, which is a foolish thing to do. But there clearly is a difference between killing somebody, which is what euthanasia or suicide are, and allowing them to die. And one is recognizing the natural end is coming, and you try and keep someone comfortable, and you let them die naturally. And the second is you actually kill them. And further to that, when you're letting someone die, and I've done a lot of research on this. If you look at the data on that, prime example, let's say you have a situation where you're on oxygen and you're requiring oxygen, and they say there's no further, so and so they're dying. There's no further continuation. Can we just remove that oxygen? I'm not talking about removing food or fluids. And if you look at that, the data shows you that about 10% of the time they simply don't die. They just continue breathing. They might die 2 or 3 days down the road, naturally, but they just don't die. But if you give me a lethal poison, I'm going to be dead, okay? So even in that, you see the clear difference between the two of, yes, there's not only a philosophical difference, there's a reality difference between killing and letting die.
Right. And actually, I would also guide our listeners to go back to episode 1, where we talk about proportionality, that you can refuse care if it's disproportionate, if your
Yeah.
ability to actually gain from that care is proportionate to the risks of that procedure, etc. So if you have a reasonable amount, a reason to have care, and it has a reasonable chance of actually treating you, then you can continue. But if it's disproportionate, you can always refuse treatment, but you cannot kill yourself. And I think that
Yeah.
that's really the difference that you're outlining there, in that. So, what are the main arguments used to persuade people to accept euthanasia and assisted suicide? And how do you respond to those arguments?
So the main talking points of the death lobby, there's really 3 of them. They are suffering, suffering, and suffering. That's what they focus on. And I sort of smile when I say it, but it's true. It's if you consider what's happened in my own country and what happens in the States when they're debating an assisted suicide bill, the other side focuses on stories of suffering. That's what they just go on and on about it. And I'm not saying that people aren't suffering. Don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting people aren't suffering. I am saying, of course, you can provide proper care for them, and there's no need to kill these people. They can be properly cared for. But nonetheless, they want you to fear a bad death. Their whole point is, and I consider my own country as to what they did by brainwashing Canadians by constantly coming up with story after story after story. These were stories that were promoted by the Dying with Dignity group in our country. The media picked them up, and we saw, like, during the euthanasia debate back in 2015 and 2016, every week there was a new story. They were able to find their supporters, and they were able to put these stories together and sell them to Canadians that, you have two choices, is what they were selling us. You could have a bad death, or you could have euthanasia. That's what they were selling. And they were creating fear. So they have everyone in fear of a bad death. So there are those radical autonomists who would go on about my body, my choice, and the rest of it. But they're actually not the majority. The majority of the people are actually been put into fear of a bad death. Well, I can understand that. So all these other technical arguments they talk about or whatever, those are all peripheral issues. The primary issue for them is suffering. And to tell you the truth, I don't like talking about suffering because right off the bat, people are in fear of suffering. And even someone who is a person of strong faith, they might understand suffering in a different way than a secular person. But at the same time, it's not like they're wanting to invite suffering into their life. So, we understand that that's a difficult thing. But I can assure you, you can be cared for. And they don't want you to believe that. So when you put these two juxtaposed questions to somebody, are you wanting to suffer, or do you want to have an easy way out, as they would say? Oh, they talk about, yes, we will just give you these. They don't call it poison, of course. They call it medication, but there's nothing medical about it. It's not medication. And then you will just die. Well, obviously, people are thinking, I don't want to suffer. So this is the big thing that's going on with it. And we can get into all these technical issues, but that's what it's about, essentially.
Yeah, and we will get into a lot of topics, including the fact that it starts off with people who are terminally ill, but then it's applied to elderly people or people with
Right.
disabilities, people with mental illness, etc. So if this argument about suffering is what they're using as an argument to justify killing oneself, well, there's a lot of different suffering, and where does it end, right? Where do you say, no, you can't get euthanasia? You can't kill yourself if you're quote unquote suffering. And as
Yeah.
you alluded, suffering from a Christian perspective can be redemptive. We all have suffering of some kind, but it can be redeemed. And obviously we're not for suffering. It's just that if you are suffering, you can bring good out of it. And so if you can comment on this idea that anyone who's suffering should be able to automatically kill themselves.
Well, yes, and the problem with this concept of suffering being killed for this is that suffering is completely subjective. Now, what am I meaning by that? I can't determine your level of suffering. It's not possible. So when the law says, so it's the same thing of whether it be the Dutch, the Belgium, the Canadian law, or the Oregon Assisted Suicide Act, it says that it refers to suffering always in these laws. But if you were to tell me that you're suffering, I can't tell you you're not suffering. If I were a physician, I'm not a physician, but if I were a physician, we could talk about ways to lessen that. We could talk about ways to, whether it be a drug regimen, whether it be certain things we can do to lower so it becomes not an extreme issue in any way. But the fact of it is that I can't determine that. So primarily, we just had a death, and I was just talking to the mother of this young man recently. We had a death of a young man who was 26. He claimed he was suffering. Obviously, he wanted to die. He was going through suicidal ideation. He was killed. But as his mother would say, he never filled the prescription he received for pain. He was telling the doctors he was in pain and he was suffering. He never filled that prescription because he wasn't suffering. When he was living at home, he wasn't suffering. He didn't have pain like that. Yes, he was psychologically convinced he needed to die. This is the whole problem with this whole concept of suffering. So you can't determine it. So the laws say that suffering as if that I can't deal with would now qualify me to be killed. Well, really what the law is about is the avenue to killing. That's what it's about. So suffering becomes the talking point to be able to kill me. I think it's very evil.
Right. And I think that it's crazy to think, we have suicide hotlines.
Yeah.
Imagine if suicide hotlines would say to anyone calling in, go kill yourself. The whole point of suicide hotlines is to say there's help for you. There are ways to come out of this. And so the juxtaposition between what suicide hotlines do, which is a great service to people who are suffering mentally, etc., versus what euthanasia and assisted suicide promises, which is, oh, you're suffering? Then go kill yourself, and we'll give you the poison to do it. Correct?
I'm going to correct you. I don't like you using this term kill yourself because neither euthanasia or assisted suicide is about killing yourself. In the case of euthanasia, it's you're being killed. It's homicide. And in fact, in Canada, we created an exception to homicide in our criminal code to allow for this. So doctors and nurse practitioners are exempt from the homicide law so long as the application form is signed by two of them. That's not very nice, that two people come together and approve my death and kill me. In the case of assisted suicide, the doctor is actually providing, they are directly involved. So this is not me doing it myself. It's someone who's directly involved with providing me a lethal poison, knowing that I'm going to drink it down. On top of it, most of these deaths are not done on their own. Most often, it's the assisted suicide lobby that will prepare that for you. I mean, they send someone to your house if you've been approved, and you say, "Oh, come visit me on. My death date is February 12th," as an example. They might say, and the assisted suicide lobby shows up there on February 12th to make sure that the whole thing has been set up properly, so you're capable of consuming it. So it's really not as we would talk about as a killing on oneself. And I think that confuses people because it's not about my autonomy. It really is about somebody else being involved with killing me. You brought up about suicide hotlines, and this is the problem we have in Canada. And I know that this is another question, and I'm sort of jumping off, but you brought up suicide hotlines. We're going to go there. We had an issue of veterans in our country contacting Veterans Affairs for help. So quite a few Canadians, I know Americans may not realize that, quite a few Canadians served in Afghanistan during that conflict. Quite a few Canadian soldiers died there, but a lot of them came back with PTSD, traumatic stress disorder, and had serious issues, serious issues, and we're not getting treatment for their PTSD because our Canadian healthcare system is absolutely messed up. And so you have people contacting Veterans Affairs trying to receive help for treatment for PTSD and being told, oh, you can have medical assistance in dying.
Wow.
Think about it. That's insanity. Now, those stories, of course, hit the media, and that was one of the reasons that the government had to back off a bit on some of the expansions that they were doing, and we'll get into that later.
Right, and also cases where people call in for actual health care, and instead they're just offered euthanasia or assisted suicide instead of
Yeah.
actual health care because it's cheaper for the insurance companies to kill you, as you
Well,
clarified
Well,
as
certainly
well.
you have that in the U.S. because you have an insurance system. We have what you'd call a universal healthcare system in Canada, which is not very helpful because it's so backlogged. You're going to have to wait months and months and months and months to get treatment, but you can get death the same day.
Wow.
This is the kind of thing we have in our country. And then they wonder why our euthanasia numbers are going through the roof.
Right. And we're about to talk more about Canada's system. One last question that's more general. How do you respond to quote unquote quality of life claims when those are invoked as the reason for euthanasia or assisted suicide?
So I think the whole question of quality of life is really problematic because it actually stems to a concept of discrimination. If I were a person with significant disabilities and I were being judged based on quality of life, I would assume then that certain people who come from how would you say, a Peter Singer philosophy that certain lives are simply not worth living because their lives have such low quality, I might be seen as definitely worth dying, and this is the kind of thing you're getting. But you're already getting this problem of quality of life in the system of our medical system. In my own country, it becomes a serious difficulty for a lot of people with disabilities to even get treatment. And then they're wondering why they're being steered towards euthanasia. Well, they're being steered towards euthanasia because obviously speaking, the concept of treatment is very hard to get for them, and they're getting backlogged on treatment, and they're in a health situation where they absolutely need good treatments for them, and they're not getting it. So the concept of quality of life is a judgment. It's a judgment. It's saying, oh, you have cerebral palsy, or you have this and that, and you require a wheelchair, and I wouldn't want to live like that. So I agree that your life is not worth living. And this is what we're getting with assisted suicide and euthanasia. The doctors are saying, well, the person requested it. I wouldn't want to live like they're living. I agree that their quality of life is low. Of course I approve them. Of course I approve them. Well, that's eugenic.
Mhm.
Now, your listeners must know what I mean by eugenics. Eugenics is a whole philosophy that certain lives, it's okay to eliminate them because their life is of a lower quality and not worth living. And of course, that had a wider meaning in World War II under the Nazi government, which looked at certain races as also having a lower quality and not worth living.
Well, thanks for clarifying that. And it's a very important point because no one should judge whether your life has value. Every single human life is sacred and has value. And so thanks for pointing that out. So now let's pivot to Canada's MAiD system. And for our listeners, MAiD stands for medical aid in dying, quote unquote. So how does Canada's MAiD system actually function in practice from the moment of request to the point of death?
So I don't like using the term MAiD because it's a made in Canada term. It was created by the euthanasia lobby to make us all feel better about killing. MAiD is, medical assistance in dying. And of course, it was intentionally created to make you confused about what it means, because obviously speaking, if I'm receiving excellent end of life care, that might be seen as an assistance in dying, but it's not an assistance in dying per se as a killing. Nonetheless, how does it work? So the law was came into place in 2016. And the original law said that your natural death had to be reasonably foreseeable. So that was the definition that had a sort of a terminal idea around it, that you had to have a terminal condition. The term in the beginning was problematic because it was never defined. So right off the bat in Canada, right in the very beginning, we started having some pretty bad cases that were popping up because it was a subjective, undefined term. Natural death is reasonably foreseeable. And as I'm absolutely convinced as a person who's been involved with this, all of our natural deaths are reasonably foreseeable. So what does that actually mean? Then what happened in 2021, our government changed that law, and they said that you don't have to have a terminal condition anymore. But if you have a terminal condition, they changed a lot to say if you have a terminal condition, you can have a same-day death. There'd be no waiting period. So people who have been defined as having a terminal condition, that their natural death is reasonably foreseeable, they literally can go to the doctor in the morning and die in the afternoon, or be killed. Let's be honest, it's being killed. Then the other group of people are those who are not dying. So they need to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. So if you have a grievous and irremediable medical condition, meaning you have a disability, you can go to your doctor, you can request it, but you'd have to wait 90 days to be killed. So I mentioned about Kiano earlier, the young man who recently died by euthanasia, and he was certainly going through a lot of mental health issues. He had suicidal ideation. He died over a 90-day waiting period. He was approved 90 days earlier, and then he was killed in December. So he clearly was not dying. He was not sick even. Did have diabetes, but you can see how this is now problematic. Now, the disability community really fought hard in 2021 against that definition because they said, you're in fact saying there is now a law that says people with disabilities can be killed by euthanasia. We just have to wait 90 days because people with disabilities always have a grievous and irremediable medical condition under the definitions that they accept, meaning that if you have a disability, you're not getting better. This is how you are. Whether someone appreciates you or not is not the point. That's how you are. We should accept everybody as they are. The law says we can kill them. So, in their bad day, they might be thinking, I've lost hope, I've lost meaning, I've lost purpose. And they might be having difficulty, let's say, with poverty. We've had people with poverty dying by euthanasia in Canada because they might have a significant disability, they're on a disability benefit, and the disability benefit doesn't give them enough money to live. And so they're thinking, I have health problems, I have this situation, and I'm living in poverty. I don't even have enough money to buy my own food. I have to go to a food bank. Well, the fact of it is that these people are sometimes seeking death and they're being approved for death. This is the kind of thing we have in Canada. And it's ridiculous. So this is how it works. It's a very simple system. Two doctors have to sign off, or two nurse practitioners have to sign off. And once they've signed off, the law says that they only have to be of the opinion They only have to be of the opinion you fit the criteria of the law. That's what the system says. So therefore, we can kill them, and the doctors are free, scot-free, because if it was actually a crazy case and they were actually investigated, their response simply is to give them cover. I was of the opinion so-and-so fit the criteria of the law. This is how it works. It's very wide. That's why we've had so many crazy deaths happening in Canada by euthanasia, because the law is wide. It's undefined. So therefore, it's up to the doctor. Let me give you a little more insight. I know this is going maybe a bit further than you wanted, but Kiano was from Ontario. He was turned down by the doctors in Ontario to be killed, but Dr. Wiebe in Vancouver approved him, so he flew to Vancouver and got killed. So he couldn't find a doctor in Ontario to kill him, but Dr. Wiebe was willing to kill him in Vancouver. This is the
Wow.
kind of thing, the doctor shopping and the whole bit, and he's dead. Yeah.
Are there specific doctors that people go to just to get the sign off, or do they usually just go to their family doctor? Or are there doctors known for signing off for your euthanasia? And as you mentioned, do people doctor shop to get those signatures?
Yes, people definitely doctor shop. It's common that the people doctor shop. We had a woman in Ottawa who was turned down 5 times in Ottawa, and she ended up dying at a euthanasia clinic in Toronto. I mentioned about Kiano going to Vancouver, but that's not the only case. There's several cases of people who were turned down by their own doctors in Ontario. I'm not saying Ontario is so much better than British Columbia. It's just that this Dr. Wiebe in Vancouver, she's killed a lot of people. She's
Mhm.
possibly our most prolific killer in Canada, and she's very wide in who she accepts for killing. So this is the kind of thing that we have, this constant acceptance of this killing. So I think that the law, there is no real safeguard. They say, oh, well, the safeguard's in the law. The safeguard is only good as a doctor who's willing to kill you.
Yeah, that's horrific. And I saw on your website that you actually have a petition to see what Dr. Weeb's practice is like, to close
Right.
it down. What's the petition and how can people
Well,
sign?
so the problem is all this is under privacy. So we have no way, other than the stories that have come out, we have no way to be able to analyze Dr. Weeb beyond the stories that we've seen, and there's been quite a few of them. So we're asking the British Columbia Ministry of Health to do an investigation into all her deaths. There was a case last year of a woman in Calgary who was approved by Dr. Weeb, and then her common law husband intervened and brought the case to court. The court granted an injunction, and then the death didn't happen. But it was all based on the fact that the common law husband said, well, she doesn't have an irremediable medical condition. She's fully treatable. There is nothing actually really wrong with her long term, but she wants to die. That's correct. And so that case, there's lots of cases like that, and we could do a whole show on the Dr. Weeb effect. But the fact of it is that yes, if you can't find a local doctor to kill you, there are several euthanasia clinics in Canada who are happy to kill you.
That's crazy. So would you say that things in Canada unraveled so quickly because of these key legal, judicial, and political decisions there? And who is behind this push to continue to unravel who should have access to euthanasia in Canada?
So what we see is that there's a well-funded euthanasia lobby, and they pushed very hard, and we had a government that was happy to collaborate with them. And so we have a law now that is ridiculously wide open. And it makes it very difficult, because how do you change such a system when you have a government that's imposed this on you? It's very, very difficult. And we haven't actually seen a change in government in Canada. So I don't know, we don't have to get into Canadian politics, but we have a continuation of that same liberal regime under a new prime minister now, but the same liberal regime, and they've been pushing for more and more and more killing. So we are scheduled to allow euthanasia for mental illness alone starting in March of 2027. And that was actually legalized technically in March of 2021 with the expansion of the law, but the government uh, at first put a 2-year moratorium on that, saying that we weren't ready for it. And then they've kicked the can down the road till March of 2027 because first of all, it's not popular in Canada, euthanasia for mental illness alone. But secondly, because the government was having all these different problems, and that the euthanasia law was being attacked right, left, and center by all these crazy cases. veterans and you name it, people with disabilities being killed and homeless people being killed. And it's just started to become a bit too much for them. So they kick the can down the road. But nonetheless, euthanasia for mental illness alone means that you wouldn't have to have any physical condition. It would just be mental illness.
Wow. That's really scary. How much of this, the fact that the government and the lobbyists push for euthanasia in Canada and the government accepted it, is caused by Canada's healthcare system?
Yeah, Canada's healthcare system is a serious problem because we have a universal healthcare system and you can't buy healthcare outside of the system. And you have a massive backlog of care in the system. And it does vary across the country. So, give you a very quick understanding, the universal healthcare system varies by province because the provinces are actually responsible for providing healthcare. So, what might be happening in British Columbia on the left coast could be very, very, very different than what's happening in Ontario because of the funding model and how it works. But even in a province like Ontario, which is a very massive province, like the size of the province, the number of people, there's 14 or 15 million people living in Ontario, but I mean, it's the size of the province. You could have a very different opportunity for healthcare in Ottawa than you would, let's say, have in London, Ontario, where I live, which are like 7 hours apart if you're driving it. So, get the situation with long waiting lists for care. You have a controlled system, sort of like a communist country would have a controlled system where there's X amount of dollars provided for this type of treatment. What it means is that people are waiting for treatment. So let's say you have a significant health condition. You're given a choice. You can be on a waiting list for 6 months, 8 months for possible. It might take you, prime example, mental illness. When I mentioned euthanasia for mental illness alone. In most communities, it would take you more than 6 months to be able to get an appointment with a psychiatrist. Have euthanasia.
And I think that that is actually what's pushing people, and that what it's a quote unquote quick and easy solution is we'll just have you killed, and then we don't have to worry about providing health care for you. So you've documented cases where euthanasia was pursued even when consent was questionable or absent. You've documented cases where euthanasia was pursued even when consent was questionable or absent. One particularly disturbing case involved a Canadian man who attempted to have his cognitively incompetent wife euthanized. Can you walk us through what happened in that case?
Yeah, that's an important case, and it goes both ways, that case, because some people are arguing that that's the case to show you that safeguards are actually working because the doctors intervened and actually removed the husband's right to make decisions for his wife. But the fact of it is that what you have is a man who wanted euthanasia for his incompetent wife and was saying that if he didn't get approved, he was going to kill her and then kill himself, homicide-suicide.
Mhm.
And there was more issues to that case further with that fact that, she was someone he would bring her close to her, and so therefore he had her walking around in these old beat up boots. So you imagine she was taken out of the home, she's put in a care home, and now she's walking around the care home in these beat up boots, and she's got dementia because this is what he's brought her. He was, constantly waking her up every morning at 6:30 in the morning, even though he wasn't living there, he'd be calling on the phone to wake her up at 6:30 in the morning. Why he was doing that, nobody knows, but he insisted that he wanted euthanasia for this woman, and, really what this shows you is a greater concern around the issue that we're debating in Canada now, which is euthanasia by advanced request. So, your listeners might not realize in Canada, we actually have 2 sets of euthanasia laws. If you're a Canadian, you'd get it in a second. We've got the Quebec law, and then we've got the federal law for the rest of Canada. And so in Quebec, they have euthanasia by advanced request. So if you were to put in your power of attorney document as an example that if I have this medical condition, I would want euthanasia, then a woman such as this, if it were in her power of attorney document, they could go ahead and kill. Now, why does this concern me? Because she originally wanted it. She originally requested it and then changed her mind. So while she was competent, she had requested it, and then she changed her mind and she said she didn't want it. So now you have a situation where the husband's pushing to have her killed, and in fact, she doesn't want it. But you can imagine the problems if you've got euthanasia by advanced request and it's now been put in her power of attorney document while she's competent. Now she's incompetent, they go ahead and kill her. This is the sort of thing that I was thinking is very important with this issue, how it comes up. Now, all of these things are crazy right off the bat. So we're talking about sad stories and peripheral issues in the sense, but Obviously speaking, I'm not opposed to euthanasia because someone might be incompetent. I'm opposed to euthanasia because it gives doctors and nurses the right and law to kill you. That's what it does. And to me, obviously the consent thing is an important issue, but the killing issue is to me the primary issue. So
Right. In this case, when she changed her mind, did she put
yeah.
that in writing? Or how exactly did she make it known that she changed her mind?
Right. What had happened in this case is she had informed the doctors that she had changed her mind, that she didn't want to die. And in fact, when she was removed from the home, based on the fact that there was complaints about her experiencing a type of espousal abuse, she was removed from the home and put into, a care home. What happened is she had informed people that no, she wanted to live. So now you have clear indication that she wants to live, but you still have a crazy husband who believes that the best thing for her is death, and he's talking about homicide, suicide. Now, this is a topic you probably weren't planning to talk to me about, but homicide suicide is actually an important issue because it's often been argued that the wonderful thing about assisted suicide is that it prevents these sad cases of homicide suicide. So if you look at the data on homicide suicide, it's almost always a husband who kills his wife and then attempts suicide or kills himself by suicide. That's how it almost always is. And when you look at the research on it, and there's some significant research on this issue, you see that almost always it's a controlling husband, and there's always signs of abuse within that couple. That the husband had been abusing his wife over the years, and as if you talk to the children of the couple, there's often that is the case. And this case actually fits perfectly within that realm because here you have a husband who was clearly controlling, he was clearly abusive, and yet, of course, he's talking about homicide, suicide, and people, use this as a reason. They say, "Oh, well, if we legalize assisted suicide, that would eliminate those terrible cases of the husband feeling so, in a terrible state because he's gotta care for his wife, and he doesn't know how to do it, and all these things, and she wants death, and so now you can have this assisted suicide and eliminate these terrible situations," and in fact, it's not true because
Mhm.
homicide, suicide's almost always about a controlling husband who kills his wife, an abusive controlling husband who kills his wife and then kills himself.
Right. And actually, this reminds me of another data point, which is that actually, where euthanasia and assisted suicide is legalized, it actually increases um, suicide and homicide. Do you have any data points on that as well?
Yeah, so that's a very difficult issue, the question of the relationship between legalizing euthanasia or assisted suicide and the increase of what we might call regular suicide. Now, first of all, suicide's always tragic, but we see that there's a suicide sort of within the person. And I think this is sort of a natural law reality. Within the person is a natural, you know, feeling that no, suicide is not a good thing. People have this, holding back from that. And you see that often with suicide, someone has a mental health issue that's driving them to want to die, or they have other issues that might be really driving them in that time where they're feeling hopeless. But when when you say it's okay to have assisted suicide, you're actually saying that suicide's okay in certain circumstances. So that whole taboo around suicide has now been lessened in that culture, and you see an increase in the suicide rate. So if you actually look at the Oregon assisted suicide situation, now Oregon's had assisted suicide for the longest in the U.S. So it was legalized in 1994, but then they had a court case on it, and then a second plebiscite. So it actually came into place in 1998. So you have a very long history. Oregon has a higher suicide rate than the average in the US. But if you look at the actual increase in suicide or the suicide rate, you've seen that it's had a greater increase in suicide than the rest of the US. Now, you might say there's other factors around suicide. That's correct. So if you look at the Netherlands, so there was a big study done on the Netherlands and Belgium because they have euthanasia, and most of the countries around them until more recently, have not had euthanasia. So if you compare, for instance, the Netherlands and Belgium to, let's say, Germany, Germany has had a drop in the suicide rate for the last 20 years. It's been a decrease in suicide, the regular suicide rate, whereas the Netherlands and Belgium have had an increase.
Mhm.
So even if you look at those laws, you see this. Now, the problem, of course, is the direct correlation question. That's a very difficult thing to answer because there's so many factors around suicide. But clearly, the opposite is definitely true. You cannot say that legalizing euthanasia or assisted suicide will lower the suicide rate because there's no proof of that. It's never happened. It might happen
Right.
over 1 or 2 years, but over the long term, it's just never happened. Therefore, clearly there seems to be an effect of lessening that suicide taboo within the culture on a greater number of suicides.
Right. And I think a lot of people don't realize this effect, but it makes sense that subconsciously, once you say that a certain kind of suicide is okay, it actually lowers the bar
Yeah.
for our protection of human life all
There
around.
there is one more issue, and that is the change in the suicide data that's happened in the US. And that is if you look historically back, let's say 30 years. I've written several articles about this because it's quite concerning that 30 years ago, the older age cohort, 75 and above, had lower suicide rates. Now, if you look at it, they have the highest suicide rate. I know we talk about teen suicide, and of course, teen suicide affects us emotionally because you say, that's so terrible. That's such a waste. These people have their lives before them. But what we don't understand is that the increase in suicide rates amongst that 75 and up age group, and even 65 and up, it's gone up significantly. But they are now have the highest suicide rate in America for the last quite a few years, for the last 5 or so years. And that is a total it's like turning the suicide data upside down is what's happened. So I think that legalizing assisted suicide and the concept that we've put into the culture that certain lives are not worth living has actually led to a decrease in the suicide taboo, but also an increase in people feeling that their life has lost meaning, purpose, and value, and they're dying by suicide, and a far greater number of that older group.
Wow. And this is why we're bringing attention to this issue. And as we'll discuss, it's not just elderly people, it's not just people with disabilities or terminal illnesses. And as you mentioned, in Canada, it's going to go towards people, it's going to go for people who have mental illness, etc. So there's and anyone who suffers with any kind of depression, etc., will be vulnerable to this. So, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But in terms of the case that I had mentioned earlier, why is it ethically significant and what does it reveal about how substituted consent can be abused once euthanasia is permitted?
So all laws that we see in the world do require you, at this moment at least in history, do require you to be the person who requests to be killed. And when we're talking about euthanasia, it is to be killed. You're not killing yourself. Someone's killing you. In the case of assisted suicide, the doctor's directly involved again. And I have to be very clear about that. This is about poisoning someone to death. But when you now can say a substituted consent, that would be a serious issue because now you have a situation of, let's say, a caregiver or a family member who is looking at mom and saying, this isn't really the same mom we knew. And isn't it terrible that mom is in this state? Wouldn't she be better off dead? So it's what you call a false compassion that would lead to killing. Now, do we see this already? The problem with all these decisions around killing somebody is they're all behind closed doors. All of these laws have a situation where somebody makes a request, and then you have a doctor or in Canada, nurse practitioners signing off and agreeing that, yes, I agree, this is acceptable. And if you look at the Canadian law, it's actually quite clear why we should really be concerned about all these things. The Canadian law says that the doctor or nurse practitioner only have to be of the opinion the person fit the criteria of the law. So if you have someone who's got really questionable capability of really requesting or consenting, meaning they have a significant level of dementia, but the doctor or nurse practitioners have a false compassion, or they've done so many euthanasia deaths, they're thinking, yeah, I wouldn't want to live like you, and they're approving them. You can't even then have a recourse legally to protect that person because the law completely protects the doctor or nurse practitioner. Even in the Oregon uh, Act on assisted suicide, they have not only given the doctors who are involved with assisted suicide legal protection, they've given them protection from being sued. So if you look actually at the Oregon Act, you see that it would be almost impossible to sue them in the case of an assisted suicide because they've approved them based on X, Y, and Z, and they're claiming that this is and also the other thing about Oregon is it uses the good faith clause. So long as the doctor says I did so in good faith, then they're clear. Well, that's the lowest level. I mean, that's the lowest level. It becomes very difficult to sue someone when they said, I made the decision in good faith. Well, how am I going to argue that? So these laws are designed to protect doctors who are willing to kill people. Now, that actually makes sense. I know I'm going on a little bit, but I think some of this makes sense if you think about it. If you think about Canada as an example, just going to use Canada as an example because I'm a Canadian. Don't hold it against me. But in on June uh, 15, 16, euthanasia was a homicide. Then they legalized euthanasia. The next day, it becomes medical aid in dying. And so if you think about it, your law had to protect the doctors because it went from being a homicide that they could serve multiple years in jail for to being medical aid in dying, which is something they could do if they sign off and say, yes, it's okay, and I'll kill you. Um, you know what I mean? This is quite a shift here, but in order for them to feel safe to kill you, they had to have the law cover them completely. And that's what you have not only in Canada, but also, as I say, in Oregon. And it's very, very crazy, in my opinion.
Wow. So, with this case, how does it directly challenge that claim that euthanasia is always about autonomy and respecting a patient's wishes? Because that's usually an argument that's made across the board. Well, this is what the person wants, my body, my choice, and just in a different way. So, could you talk about that? Obviously, in this case, is the substituted consent issue is a big issue, and that falls flat in the face of autonomy and the patient's wishes.
So this case is sort of like an outlier extreme case. Yes, that's correct. But I'm I believe that if you consider what autonomy is and what this whole concept of free choice actually means, if you could think of the bioethics arguments, that euthanasia never fits it. It never fits it. How can it be about my body, my choice, my autonomy, my, when somebody else is injecting you with lethal poison? It doesn't add up. It's all about a lie. I talk about this as being an issue about a lie. They say it's all about me, what I want, my autonomy, my free choice, but a doctor's going to lethally inject me. I don't. And then you're saying it's all about me, but I can't divorce the philosophical positions or the beliefs of the doctor who's willing to kill me from the reality of me being killed. You can't say it's all about my choice in those circumstances. It's simply not possible. Is it a form of autonomy? Not really. Suicide might be a form of autonomy, even though often it's related to mental health issues and it's always a tragedy because someone might, within their cognitive situation, free to decide, and then do it to themselves. But when you have someone else directly involved in the act, it's a lie, it's a lie, it's a lie. It's not about my body. It's not about my choice. It's not about autonomy. It's not about that at all. It is about killing. That's what it's about. It's about
Right.
poisoning someone to death. And we can, and I'm not very, how would you say, flexible in my old age. When I look at these things, I say, you'd have to have a real contortion to actually believe what they're saying. But of course, the culture wants to believe what they're saying because we all believe in free choice and autonomy. You know, we all believe in these things because that's what makes the whole culture fly right now. It's I should be able to do what I want as long as I don't affect another. Well, wait a second. When you lethally inject me, you're certainly affecting another, and you're also affecting culture in general. So yes, I don't even buy into that argument, and I think it's a false distinction that they've made, and people have happily bought it because they want this to be true based on their fears.
Yeah, and I'll clarify too, just from what you said. Obviously, whether it's suicide or whether it's euthanasia or assisted suicide, these are all sister situations because one is you're killing yourself directly. The other one, in assisted suicide, you're have a doctor who's helping you kill yourself, and with euthanasia, you have a doctor or another medical person killing you. So, I know these are all tragic situations, and it
They're all
all
trying.
results in your death. And so, we're here to talk about the sacredness of human life, and that in all these situations, killing yourself or allowing someone to kill you is never the right solution, ever.
Correct. Since now we're on suicide, and I know we need to move on, but I think it's important to recognize that these are actually so similar. The reasons why someone asks to be killed by euthanasia, and I say be killed again because it's correct, um, is very similar to the reasons why someone might seek suicide. Because when you talk to these people, and I've talked to a lot of people who've been approved for euthanasia or who are seeking euthanasia. We have a helpline with the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. You know, I had no idea when I started talking to all these people who have been seeking it or who have been approved already, what I would actually experience was so consistent. Almost always, these people are saying, I feel my life lacks meaning. I feel my life lacks purpose. I don't see a reason to continue to live. I feel hopeless. I'm lonely. They might have a significant health problem. I had a guy call me from British Columbia and he was talking to me. I have no idea how he got the number, but someone obviously said you should call this number and talk to them. And he was seeking euthanasia and he had multiple health issues. I mean, multiple health issues. And like really my heart, went out to this guy because he's describing all these health situations. And and when someone's calling you like that and you don't know who they are, they don't know who you are, you listen. You spend a lot of time listening. You might ask a few questions, but you want to create a connection because obviously he's talking about having himself killed.
Hmm.
And I think that's a terrible thing.
Yeah.
So I'm doing a lot of listening. But at the end of the conversation, as it was coming to an end, I asked him the question, well, why do you want the doctor to kill you, though? Because that's what you're asking for. I was very clear. And you think that maybe he'd be all, and I'm talking to him on the phone, so I don't know if he jumped back or not. But no, he didn't. He didn't actually react negative at all. He was very straightforward with me. And he says, but Alex, I have nobody in my life.
Mhm.
I feel I have no reason to live. He didn't say, remember, he's described to me his health conditions. They're significant. He didn't say, I'm suffering so greatly, Alex, I can't handle it any longer. As much as I might not agree with killing someone, I can understand the motivation then, can't I? I can. I can understand that motivation, but that's not what he said. That's not what he said at all. And this is common. This is not only common, this is almost universal in my experience.
Another case that you've spoken about is Mrs. B, who was euthanized despite
Yeah.
clearly expressing that she did not want to die. Can you walk us through that story?
Right. The case of Mrs. B actually was one of the Ontario cases that was focused in one of their coroner's reports. So I'll just explain to you very quickly where this information comes from, and I'm happy to share it with people if they want to email me about it or if they email you about it, and I could send them actually all the original source model. So what you have is in Ontario, when someone dies by euthanasia, they have to send in their report. The doctor has to send in the report to the coroner's office, the Ontario Coroner's Office. So the chief coroner set up a committee to examine those deaths. Now, every province in Ontario in Canada are a little bit different. So most of those of the provinces of Canada have the doctor send their euthanasia report per se after the death. They have it sent to the Ministry of Health. But in Ontario, it's to the chief coroner. So the coroner set up a committee, and the committee was looking at these cases, and they found that between 2018 and 2023, there was about 340 cases that were considered outside the parameters of the law that they did not fit. Now, some of them, it was based on the paperwork. So you would say, okay, the person probably qualified as the law is written, etc. But the doctor was really shoddy in its paperwork, or maybe there wasn't a second signature, which is very serious, meaning that they made the decision to kill you, but they didn't get a second doctor or nurse practitioner to sign off. But then there's some cases like Mrs. B, and there's a few others like that. And so you get these cases where somebody is clearly not capable of consenting. Okay, you get a couple cases like that. There was actually another one which I think was even stronger, and I want to get into it because there's a case of a guy who had no medical condition whatsoever. That's another case. It was
Mhm.
crazy, and you see it in the coroner's report. They were writing it up. Now remember, no doctor has been arrested. No doctor has lost their medical licenses, and these are all Ontario cases. And so here you have a case of a guy who had a reaction to his COVID shot. Now I'm not going to get into COVID discussion with you. You can do that with another person. But I mean, so he's going through fibromyalgia type conditions, and he's got mental health issues. So he's the first time he was put into a psychiatric ward because of his mental health conditions. The second time that he was involuntarily put in because of his mental health conditions, he asks for euthanasia. He gets approved for euthanasia based on pain.
Mhm.
Okay. Then they kill him by euthanasia. They do an autopsy. Now, there's very few autopsies. Very, very few autopsies after euthanasia, unless it's a really rare medical condition. Usually they know how you died, so they don't do an autopsy. There's just no autopsies. Anyway, they did an autopsy on this guy and they found nothing wrong with him. Nothing,
Mm.
nothing. And so you have the coroner's report coming out that there's nothing wrong. There was nothing wrong with this guy. Yes, he had fibromyalgia type conditions. They weren't questioning that. They just said there was literally nothing wrong with this guy. Could he have been better the next year or the year later? We don't know because he's dead. He's dead.
Wow,
Dead
that's
people, of course, don't get better. They're dead. So there's multiple cases like that. So I can actually send you a bunch of these cases anybody wants to know. And if you're listening to it, my email's info@epcc.ca, info@epcc.ca, and I can send you those articles. It's quite concerning.
that's really chilling. And in both the case that you mentioned and Mrs. B, seems like a lot of things have failed, even with whatever the laws are in place. So, would you say that in these cases, what failed? The law, the medical professionals, institutional pressure, or the broader culture? Because obviously there weren't any quote unquote safeguards.
Well, there is no safeguards in the law. So even if you look at the Oregon law has some type of a safeguard because you have to be within 6 months of death to be approved. So that's pretty significant, you would say. But how do you determine 6 months? I think it's a very important question because the law actually is interpreted to mean that if you have no medical treatment, you would be within 6 months of death. So there are people such as there's been several people there's been cases where they had asked for assisted suicide in Oregon. They were approved for assisted suicide. Jeanette Hall is the prime case. Jeanette Hall had cancer. She was told that she had 6 months to live. She didn't want treatment. She was afraid of treatment. Now, the reason she was afraid of treatment is her aunt had cancer and her aunt lost her hair. It didn't work out for her. The treatment was horrific on her. Her aunt died a bad death. And Jeanette was like, I don't want to go through that. But anyway, Jeanette had a doctor who did not believe in assisted suicide, the oncologist. And he said to Jeanette, Jeanette, um, he found out her son was at the time in police college. And he said, Jeanette, wouldn't you want to see your son graduate from police college? Because she wanted no treatment. She was just accepting. I don't want to have any treatment. I'm willing to die. And she wanted assisted suicide because if without treatment, she was likely to be dead within 6 months. And she said, "Yeah, I would love to see my son graduate from police college." She said, "Well, if we try some treatments that are very, you know, non-invasive, the whole thing, I guarantee you're going to live at least long enough to see your son graduate from police college." So she agreed. And she reacted very well to the treatment. It went very well for her. And so he said to her, "Well, you're doing really, really well." He says, "Wouldn't you like to see your son get married someday?" She said, "I'd love to see my son get married someday." And he said, "Well, if you agree to, you're doing very well with treatment. Your body's reacting very well to the treatment. It's going very well for you. Why don't we try a more, extensive treatment?" And she said yes. And she went into remission. And she's still alive today. 26 years later, and she's happy to
Wow.
be alive. So when you consider it, how would she have been approved if you consider she's still alive today? She's going to be approved based on the fact that she didn't want treatment, which meant her prognosis was she could be dead within 6 months. But with treatment, she might have survived. Well, in fact, she did survive. She went into remission, and she's not the only one like that. So when you look at the whole question, why are they approving people now for assisted suicide in the US who have eating disorders?
Mhm.
That doesn't make any sense. You have a 6-month prognosis, but you have an eating disorder. Now, is an eating disorder a terminal condition? Well, no, it's actually not a terminal condition. Some people do die because they don't recover from their eating disorder. They continue not to eat. And if you continue not eating, or if you continue with bulimia, you know, it it will cause your death if you actually don't turn the corner, right? But I mean, very few people actually die of eating disorders. That is a fact. Look at the data. It's very clear. Very few people do. But they're saying now, oh, this person has such an extreme condition that they could be dead within 6 months. Therefore, they approve them for assisted suicide and they kill them. Well, dead people don't recover,
Mhm.
whether it be eating disorders, whether it be diabetes, whether it be whatever it be. And so we have to understand this. So, when we talk about safeguards, the problem is that the safeguards really don't exist because there's nothing, how would you say, fundamental that you can put your hat on here. Everything has to be interpreted. So if you look at the Canadian situation, doctors approving someone. Kiano is the example I've been talking about. Diabetic, young man, He has a bit of neuropathy, but he's not in pain, even though he claimed he was in pain. His mother would tell you over and over again, no, he wasn't in pain. He took no painkillers. He was fine. Um, and he's lost some eyesight because of his diabetes. He's approved for euthanasia, but essentially what was going on is he had serious mental health issues.
Mm,
So instead of investigating the mental health issues, they kill him. Guess what? Dead people don't recover from mental health issues. They're dead.
right. And I think all of these cases that you're talking about really highlight that safeguards collapse really easily once euthanasia becomes normalized. So
What
if you could sum up on this topic, just for our listeners, what they need to understand about the fact that safeguards, I think people kind of lean on the quote unquote safeguards, thinking that it actually protects people. But if you
well,
were to just sum it up in a sentence, what would you say about safeguards, especially as you've seen in Canada and other countries?
safeguards are actually designed to pass a law. They're not designed to stay in place. What am I saying? Safeguards are used by the politicians to say, "Oh, well, we won't be like Canada. You know, we will be different than that." But what happens is once the law is legal, they become then what you call a hindrance to people wanting to get this legal service. So I'll just give you a quick. I know you wanted just a word, but in Canada, we got rid of the terminal illness requirement of the law based on equality rights. They said people who have chronic conditions are being denied the same legal service as someone who has a terminal condition, and that is unjust because it lacks equality. So, out of fairness and equality, we got rid of our terminal illness requirement. Think about it. The safeguard was put in place to pass the law, it was removed because it lacked equality. And in that argument, is correct. Let me give you a better argument 18 years old. In Canada, you have to be 18 to die by euthanasia. Now they're debating children dying by
Mm.
euthanasia. They say that this is a discrimination to deny children euthanasia. Well, that's correct. It is a discrimination. Yeah, that's correct. But so once it's legal, once it's okay to kill a 19-year-old or an 18-year-old, why is it not okay to kill a 17-year-old? I think that's better to make people understand. The safeguard is only there to sell the law to the politicians. Over time, it will go. They will all disappear because they all become discriminatory towards somebody.
Wow. I think you actually summed it up quite well. You spoke earlier about Kiano's case. What does Kiano's story reveal about how mental illness, disability, and social vulnerability are increasingly entangled with euthanasia decisions?
So the first problem with the question of mental illness is that someone might have physical conditions. That's correct. But what's actually driving them to want to die is often their mental health issues. So Keanu's not the only one who's had euthanasia, and mental health was the primary reason for it. But they had another health condition. Now, in his case, it was actually pretty scary ridiculous what was approved. But anyway, the fact of it is that it's very hard to determine whether someone with mental health issues, that it's the mental health issue that's driving their wish to die rather than their physical conditions. But also, we have to understand the nature of the human person. And I think a lot of people really miss this. Humans, we're not computers, right? You can't just program us. And we're created in such a way, and I do believe we're created, we're created in such a way to be a little bit complicated. So if I'm sick, or if you're sick, Arena, it's natural that you're going to have an emotional, psychological, spiritual reaction to that. And some people more than others. So we find that when people have cancer, and if you do the research on this, you see that often people who have cancer need help with depression. It's not that they are maybe more likely to have depression as a person, but because of their condition, it's affected them emotionally and psychologically in such a way so deeply that they become very depressed. And that's normal. That's normal. If I feel my life has, I'm going through difficult conditions, it might really drive me to a place where I think my life, it's too much for me to handle right now. But it shows you that the only real answer to that is how do we care for the other? But when you legalize euthanasia, it turns it upside down. Everything gets turned upside down. Because what happens now is I'm going through a difficult health condition. I'm really feeling down, and I might be thinking about death. Well, there is nothing new about that arena. There's nothing new that I might be thinking about death. Historically, that's the way it always was. The difference is once you legalize this, you kill them. If you don't legalize this, then you have to consider, well, how do we help this person? Is there some good counseling? Does this person have friends or family that should be visiting more often? Maybe we have to have the nurses to do a lot of talk therapy with them. You know, whatever might help this person is what you'd be thinking of if you can't kill them. But if you can kill them and they become very depressed and they're asking for death, the other thing about this is it's very scary what happens once you legalize this because you may not be yourself anymore. I'll give you an example. I got a call from a woman in Hamilton, Ontario. She calls me up and she says, Alex, I'm absolutely shocked. We're a Christian, we're Christians. My husband was a pro-life leader in the 90s. She said, now he's in palliative care and he's asking for euthanasia. And I can't figure it out because he would never, ever, ever have considered this to be an option for him. And she's talking to me about it. She's wanting to know what to do. And we had a long discussion about it. And the long and the short of it is he did die a natural death. She did spend a lot of time talking to him and working with I helped her see what she needed to say and how she needed to try and bring him through this. But after he died, this one nurse at the palliative care place said to her, "Oh, yeah, I just wanted you to know that like 10 days ago, your husband in the middle of the night was going through a real crisis. I just want you to know I sat with him and we spent a lot of time talking and I spent quite a bit of time with him and we discussed all his options. And I just want you to know that we decided at the end of that conversation that MAiD was the best option for him."
Oof.
So think about this. Here you've got a guy who's going through physical issues. He's approaching death. He's psychologically, like she said to me, "Oh, if you talk to my husband, you might not realize it, but I know my husband. It's not him anymore. He's psychologically not the same person right now." And that's not uncommon. The difference is you legalize euthanasia, now you can kill him when he's going through his low point, when he's at his low point. And people don't think about that. They don't think about how this really does affect not only the person who might be, that radical autonomist who says, "It's my body, my choice, Alex. Get out of my way. I will do what I want." They're actually the minority, in case you're wondering.
Mhm.
It affects the other person who says, "No, I would never believe in that." And then they're going through that really difficult time of their life and they're psychologically affected to the point where they're not really themselves anymore. How do you protect them from themselves? So in this case, his wife did break through because she loved him so greatly. She spent time with him and she prayed with him and and he did say, "Yeah, yeah, I'll change my mind." And he did die a natural death. Nonetheless, you could see other circumstances where he would have been dead. Okay, he would have been dead and his wife would have been in shock. But you can see how the power of that nurse in the middle of the night
Mhm.
was on this guy.
Yeah, and the word that comes to mind is vulnerable. It
Absolutely.
sounds like euthanasia and assisted suicide really preys on the most vulnerable in society, those who are sick and, like you said, probably depressed also from their physical condition, or maybe just have mental illness or any of that, any kind of disability, and there's a vulnerability there. And
Yeah.
if you offer death to somebody who's vulnerable, that's not what we're called to do. We're called to help them through that situation. And in fact, those who are the most vulnerable require the most protection and
Yes.
the most care.
So the interesting thing, Arena, is this issue of vulnerable. I think we talked about it wrong all these years because we didn't understand what it meant to be human, or we didn't want to get into the real nature of the human person because we are all vulnerable.
Mhm.
Like I'm not vulnerable right now, you would say. I'm obviously a person who's quite strong in my beliefs, etc. You're not pushing me around too much, you know. So, but we all become vulnerable at times in our life, and that's what we're not thinking of. See, the problem with talking about the vulnerability is we start thinking of that 92-year-old woman who's really frail, or we think about the person in the wheelchair who's got a lot of health issues, and we're thinking, and then someone says, "But I'm not that person, Arena. I'm not that person. You can legalize this for me. I'm not that person." But in reality, we all become vulnerable. When I'm talking to somebody on the phone who's talking about death, I can give you several more stories. You start realizing this is somebody who's going through a very difficult time of their life. We agree. We agree. And they are very emotionally distraught. They have become vulnerable.
Mhm.
And this is where they're at. The other thing about the wealthy issue, if you look at the data, most assisted suicide in the US is done on people who are upper middle class or higher and are highly educated. So they're that radical autonomous type, often the two income, low, no kids type people, etc. But the fact of it is they're actually very vulnerable because of the fact that they are wealthy. They are someone who's always had their way. But on top of it, they might have family members who are thinking, dude, that's a wonderful thing for you to do. Because guess
Mhm.
what? You leave your mortal coil early, I get more inheritance.
Mhm.
Think about it. It is a reality. We've seen cases like that too. So
That's super scary. Um, I want to pivot to I think this is going to be a difficult part, more difficult than the other parts of the conversation.
yes.
But for people who don't really know what's involved with euthanasia or
Okay.
assisted suicide, obviously you mentioned that people are being poisoned.
Yep.
But can you describe plainly, walk us through what death by euthanasia or assisted suicide actually looks like?
So this is a very important topic because I've been doing this work for a very, very long time. I'm going to give you a bit of history and I'm going to go into it. So maybe I'm going to give you a longer answer than you want. But years ago, I remember a study out of the Netherlands which showed that there was a significant problem with failure around euthanasia. And so they described failure in several ways. The person didn't die was a failure. So, we tried to kill you, but you didn't die. That was a failure. That was a smaller number. You had people who were going into convulsions. So there was a certain percentage
Mhm.
that went into convulsions and people weren't happy about that. You had people throwing up. So when you threw up and it was so a harsh way. And the other thing is the drugs were very horrific on the body and you get these reactions to it. And I'm reading these articles. I'm thinking, well, who would ever want to legalize this? They call it a death with dignity. There ain't no death with dignity here. So they changed how they did it. And so what they do now, and they've been doing it ever since, is they give you a multi-poison cocktail. Okay, so in the US, you have assisted suicide. In Canada, we have euthanasia. The type of drug or poison they're using is very similar. The difference is how it's carried out, right? In euthanasia, the doctor injects you. In assisted suicide, it comes as a soluble sort of powders, and then you have to drink it down. So you have one part of your drug system is to put you into coma. And that makes sort of sense. You don't want them thrashing around. Another part of the drug system is to put you into paralysis. You have to be paralyzed. Well, you're not going to go into convulsions if you're paralyzed. So now, right off the bat, two-thirds of the drug system makes it look like it's so peaceful because they fell asleep. Well, guess what? If you put me in coma and you paralyze me, it's going to look pretty peaceful. And then the third drug system, actually, they say, we all think it's to shut down your heart, but actually, they're not using a drug to shut down your heart. They're actually using a drug which actually paralyzes your lungs. So
Mhm.
you stop breathing. Now, obviously, when you stop breathing, your heart will also stop, also. So we, they say it's peaceful, but can you actually prove it's peaceful? If someone's in coma and they're going through a situation where the lungs are starting to fill with fluid, and they're losing their ability to breathe. Would that be peaceful? Now, the argument is that the amount of poison drug they're using to put you into coma is so great that there's no way people are feeling anything. But we also know from surgeries that there's a certain percentage of people who have had these horrible experiences where they were put into, they've been put into a type of a coma, obviously for the surgery, right? And then you have the anesthesiologist trying to keep everybody, you know, down in such a way that you don't ever feel anything throughout that surgery. But you can read stories of people who went through horrific situations and yet they couldn't respond, obviously,
Mm.
right? So this is the reality of the drug poison mixture. They're going to tell you it's about a peaceful death. Now, here's the other thing you need to know. In Oregon, for instance, in 2023, one of the deaths in 2023 lasted 137 hours.
Oof.
So you have the situation of the long drawn out death. Now, in 2024, the longest time of death was 26 hours. So not so bad, but there's been many deaths. You look to the data, there's just been many deaths that were more than 3 days, more than 72 hours. And So could you imagine someone's taken this lethal, poisonous substance, and now they lay there, and because of how the body is, the body, fights back. The body is designed to live. So some people actually are reasonably healthy. I mean, their lungs continue to breathe. They might be labored breathing, but they continue to breathe and the heart continues to beat. And it goes on for days. There was a couple circumstances where people actually, after several days woke up and said, I'm not gonna use the words that the article said about what they said, but wait, what happened to me? And then they ended up, in all those cases, they ended up dying a natural death. There was no story of someone who woke up on assisted suicide and said, "Give me another dose." That doesn't
Yeah.
happen. But anyway, so this is the situation. So they want to sell you a peaceful death. The other thing, it burns your throat.
Mm.
The drug that they give you in the mixture is very harsh. So, for instance, in Canada, since it's done, they hook you up and then they use a plunger to have it go into your system quickly. But they first use like a type of a drug to numb your veins in your arm. So I'm showing my arm in order to, so they hook you up with the IV. So they numb your veins because obviously, if it's going to burn your throat, it'll burn your veins too. Now, in the case of euthanasia, it does go quicker because they use a plunger system and an IV system. So it's not just hooking up an IV, like they literally plunge it in. So you have a massive dose hitting you fast. Um, but there's nothing good about euthanasia. There's nothing good about assisted suicide. It's all about poison and it's all about the same idea. It is about killing.
Crazy. Is this the same drug cocktail that's used in lethal injection for death row inmates?
So that's where we have some data from the issue of death row inmates receiving lethal injection, because there are almost no autopsies after assisted suicide. And I've already explained that in Canada too. There's almost no autopsies after euthanasia. And the reason is that we actually know how they died. So, for instance, I do know of some autopsies. For instance, Alicia Duncan, her mother died by euthanasia, and she was very angry about her. Or both her and her sister were very angry about it because her mother was going through mental health issues, and they killed her. They were very angry about this. So they did get an autopsy done of Donna Duncan, and they found that this is true. So anyway, Joel Zivit is a researcher. He's actually a Canadian. Don't hold it against him, but he teaches in the U.S. He's teaches in the U.S. He has a good teaching position. Anyway, he's an anesthesiologist by training, and he's opposed to the death penalty. He's done a lot of research into the autopsies of people who have died by lethal injection through capital punishment. And it shows clearly that they have these lungs filled with fluid.
Mm.
Now, is it the same drug? No, they're very similar drugs. Same. He would explain to you, no, that it's not quite the same drug they're using. Now, in some cases, they are using a pretty much of an identical mixture. Nonetheless, he's pointing to you, though, it's the same drug families, right? It's the same thing. You get the same reaction. And he's explained that when they looked at these autopsies, it showed you that death by lethal injection on death row was essentially death by drowning. Now,
Wow.
it's very interesting. You get the American Civil Liberties Association, ACLU. They're talking about this being a horrific way to die. They argue that this is torture. And yet at the same time, the same group supports assisted suicide. And you start scratching your head. How could it be torture in the case of someone dying by capital punishment, but it's not torture in the case of someone dying by assisted suicide? It either is or it isn't. It's the same thing with, you might remember the Sarko case of Dr. Nitsky in the Netherlands, who killed a woman in his sarcopod, which is that, pod that you had to the woman was put into a pod and she had to press the button which would release the gas. And over several minutes, it took her to die. And then she died. Okay. So this is an assisted suicide because she had to press the button herself. Anyway, they were talking about the fact that she was thrashing around within that
Mm.
sarcopod before she died and everything. And then she died. But, they would say, well, she voluntarily did this. So this is okay. But if you read the literature, they would say that doing that to a dog or a cat, because using gas for euthanasia for a dog or a cat, etc., they would say, well, that's inhumane. You're causing them to suffer greatly. But in the case of euthanasia, that's not inhumane. Like it's all ridiculous if you start thinking about it. It's all ridiculous. But essentially speaking, it's because of their political motivations. I'm not in favor of capital punishment anyway. I think it's wrong to kill people. I don't think we should give doctors or nurse practitioners or doctors' assistants or anybody like that the right and law to kill me. I don't feel safe in a culture that allows that. But in the same way, I don't think I should give the government the right to kill me in capital punishment. Not to say that I don't have strong emotions around a situation where someone might have done a horrific crime. Nonetheless, I can't justify killing.
Mm. I want to pivot now to some of the data. And you already mentioned, for example, that wealthy people might be more vulnerable. Looking at the polling and government data identified, what are the main reasons people request euthanasia? And what are the most commonly cited motivations?
So, it's interesting because the Oregon data is what you have to look at because there's very few accurate data outside of that. And the Oregon assisted suicide data, you would think it has to do with pain and symptom management issues because that's what everyone wants to sell to you, that this is all about suffering, suffering, and suffering. Because, the three talking points for the other side is suffering, suffering, and suffering. But in fact, what you have is a situation where pain and symptom management is actually not even in the top 5 for reasons for requesting assisted suicide. Now, if you look at the Canadian data, the number actually looks higher. So you'd say, oh, I guess Canadians must suffer more. But in fact, it's got not to do with that. It has to do with the question that they ask. The question that they ask in Canada is are you in pain or do you have concern around pain? Well, obviously speaking, if I have a medical condition, I might have concern about pain. So obviously the numbers are going to look much higher in the Canadian issue than it would in Oregon, where they're asking you, are you requesting this based on pain? Nonetheless, the biggest issues are actually social issues. I don't want to be a burden on somebody. I am unable to do the things I could do before. Meaning, let's say I used to go for a walk every day. I'm in a medical condition now where I clearly can't go for a walk every day. I feel my life is therefore less valuable in that sense. I feel my life lacks meaning, purpose, or value. In Canada, when you look at the data, it also shows you this high number of people who are requesting based on someone being, um, lonely. So loneliness is a key factor. And even then, when you see the data and it's showing loneliness being a key factor in the Canadian data, that's actually even underreported. Now, why am I saying it's underreported? Well, if I have a significant health condition, I might be driven to want to die based on my loneliness. That's correct, right? I might be very, very lonely and I'm driven to want to die. But in reality, you know, I'm asking for it for the reasons they're going to approve me for, which are maybe my physical condition. So when you're seeing these high numbers around loneliness, you realize that that's only the tip of the iceberg. It's only the tip of the iceberg. So when it comes down to it, how do they sell assisted suicide? Every state, when you have a law, a bill before the legislature, what are they talking about? They're talking about cases of suffering. And of course, my heart goes out to these people. I'm a human being. I don't want to suffer. I don't want anybody to be suffering like that. Of course not. But, first of all, we can do things to eliminate that suffering. And that's the first question. Well, why aren't we helping this person be comfortable? That's the first question I ask. But then the second thing is, but that's actually not the primary reason people are asking. The primary reasons are actually these social questions around this issue.
Mhm.
And that's why the disability community is so concerned about this, because the disability community says, well, I have these realities all the time. I can't. I'm dependent on my wheelchair to get around. I'm just not free to go around. I have social barriers. I might be living in poverty, or have very, different questions. I might have other medical issues concerning me that are going on. And you're talking about this for those reasons. Obviously, it's disability based, and they're correct on that. That is absolutely true. If you consider why people are actually asking for this, and the other thing is when you're talking about the whole pressure. If I feel like I don't want to be a burden on someone and someone's offering me death as a solution, you're dealing with someone who actually has a social need, but you're going to kill them. If you
Mm.
start thinking that through, it's really quite evil if you start thinking through what we're actually doing with this.
Right. And I think it was probably a surprising statistic that most of the reasons why people go the route of euthanasia or assisted suicide is for social reasons. But could you talk also about the demographics of assisted suicide? Who is more likely to want assisted suicide and euthanasia? Males, females. You talked about social economic status, education. Can you talk a little bit, or age? Who are more likely from the data that we do have?
It's the white word and the wealthy, the white word and the wealthy, the ones who have always had their way. They have their nice home, they have their nice car, and now they want to be dead. And you see, it becomes then a social issue for them. They don't want to go through the difficulty. Now, I don't want to go through difficulty, and I don't want to even a poorer person to go through the difficulties of life. I'm not interested in that. But the fact of it is it's a demand. It's a demanding side of things. But they are therefore they don't care that this affects other people. So when you have a situation in Canada where you have a woman who has multiple chemical sensitivities and is then living in an apartment in social housing because of her poverty. She's in poverty because of the fact that because of her reaction to chemicals around her, she can't hold down a full-time job. So now she's on disability benefit. She's living in social housing because she can't afford an apartment or a house that's not in a social housing situation. So she's actually living in an apartment building with multiple, low rental around her. And she says, I can't even leave my bedroom because of the smells and the chemicals and the whatever that's around me from my neighbors, from the building, from being the cleaning fluids that are being used, etc. I can't even leave my bedroom because of my reaction, my extreme reaction to my chemical sensitivities. And the answer was euthanasia.
Yeah.
So I know that the white word in the wealthy would say this is about my freedom, but what about the woman who needed proper housing?
Mhm.
What about the guy in St. Catharines who's told he has to leave his apartment because there's a new owner? I already told that story. There's a new owner, and he has to leave his apartment because the building is going to be redone. And he says, well, with my back disability, I can't imagine living a homeless life. So he asks for euthanasia and even tells the doctor. I tell this story clearly. He tells the doctor, I don't want euthanasia at all. I need a place to live. I can't afford a place to live. He gets approved for euthanasia. And if it wasn't for the GoFundMe page, he would have had no place to live. He would have died by euthanasia. There was a GoFundMe page that raised money for him. And you start thinking about this. So there's the collateral effect of the demand to die. Yes, but the majority are, yes, the white, worried, and the wealthy. Absolutely, no question about it. And and it's actually most prominent. Like even if you look at Oregon, well over 90% of the people who die by this is a suicide in Oregon are white, worried, and wealthy. Then the same similar situation shows up in California. Now, why is it more pronounced in California? Because California has a massive Hispanic population. So actually, the if you look at the demographics, the white population is by far the minority. It's just true. Look at the demographics. But nearly everyone dying by assisted suicide in California is white, worried, and wealthy.
And would you say that males or females are more apt to go the route of assisted suicide or euthanasia?
So the only way to actually really deal with the male or female issue is to look at the Canadian situation where you've got track one and track two. So track one is the terminally ill people, people who are deemed to be terminally ill, that is, and they can have a same day death. And those people tend to be equal in number almost between male and female. But when you look at the track two cases, so the people who have chronic conditions, these are people who have to have a 90-day waiting period because they're not dying anytime soon. They have no medical condition that will cause their death, but because they have a disability, they've been approved based on having an irremediable medical condition. So they're based on having a disability. Those numbers are far more female oriented. Like the numbers are significantly higher for women than as for men. If you look at the Dutch situation where you have euthanasia for mental illness, I'm not saying women are more mentally ill. What I'm saying is the factors lead more women in the Netherlands who have mental illness issues to ask for euthanasia than men. It's significantly higher. So if you look at the data between how many, like there was about what was it, like about 100 or so who died by euthanasia in the previous year due to mental illness. If you look at that data, that's far higher number for women than for men. So you get this sort of interesting situation that the track two, that means the non-terminally ill deaths. So I think that there's certain social pressures or maybe something about our physiology that makes it different when we're talking about people who are actually not dying at all and they are being given death as a solution to their health condition.
Mhm. Now, when we look beyond Canada, and you spoke a bit about the U.S. and Belgium and other countries, but let's take a look at Europe, New Zealand, Australia. What have we learned from countries like Belgium and the Netherlands that legalized earlier, and what kind of a takeaway message should we get from them, especially since they've been at it for so long?
There's several issues with the Netherlands and Belgium, and we've seen the same in Canada where every year the numbers increase, always increases. Secondly, it's always expanding. It's and now you might argue, people will argue, well, Alex, the Dutch law has never been amended. That's true. But the interpretation of the Dutch law has been massively amended. So what you have is you have the physicians group in the Netherlands who have said this is now acceptable, this is now acceptable. So I remember there was an article around 2009 that was published in a major psychiatric journal talking about euthanasia for psychiatric issues is possible in the Netherlands. So previous to 2009, there was basically no euthanasia for psychiatric issues alone. Now, there might have been some euthanasia for people who had physical conditions, but also psychiatric issues, but there was basically none. And then after 2009, you start seeing the numbers creeping in, and it's gone up, 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 up. So
Mm.
that was an interpretation change of what the law allows for. And you get this expansion, expansion, expansion. So it always expands. It also always expands in who you allow. So in 2015, Belgium changed their law to allow there to be no age limit. So now that
Mhm.
allowed euthanasia for children, euthanasia for newborns, euthanasia for anybody based on the situation that they had requested if the doctor deemed they qualified, etc. So that was actually an amendment to the law to expand it. But even in Belgium, you've had a change in the interpretation of the law. Now, further to the Netherlands, Belgium. Netherlands and Belgium never had an age, a terminal requirement. There was no 6 month or 1 year terminal prognosis issue. It was never like that. But they saw it as a last resort. So you read the law and it always says last resort. So originally doctors interpreted the law to mean that there's nothing else I can do for you. Now that's very different than Canada, where in Canada it's not seen as a last resort, that it's
Mhm.
seen as just like any other thing. You can say yes or no to surgery. You can say yes or no to euthanasia, etc. That's how it's seen, right? It's got nothing to do with a last resort. But over the years in the Netherlands, the interpretation of that has changed. So now the concept is it reasonable the treatment might be effective treatment, but is that reasonable to ask someone to have this treatment? Now, in the whole concept of Catholic social teaching, you would talk about treatment, which is extraordinary or ordinary treatment, which might be difficult for you, or basically ordinary and non-invasive type thing, and what would be your moral response to that? Here, we're talking about is it reasonable? We can kill you, even though there might be treatment for you, but was that treatment reasonable? Well, was killing you ever reasonable? Anyways, this is what we've seen. Now, what's been really upsetting is Australia has recently amended their laws also. So they originally had, now they have, it's like the US and Australia where every state or so therefore every state has their own law. But they originally had situations in their original laws which said that, only doctors, first, only a patient could request was the one thing. They had conscience rights in their laws, etc. So you have these situations in their laws that created some limitations, meaning that doctors can't bring it up. So it had to be a clear idea that you brought up to the doctor. That's been eliminated from the laws, taken out, etc. Now they've expanded it. A lot of these laws also originally had waiting periods. So now they've been eliminating the waiting periods. Same thing in Canada. In Canada, the original law had a 10-day waiting period. And then when we amended the law in 2021, we got rid of the 10-day waiting period so you can have a same day death. Same day deaths mean no chance to rethink this. Dead people don't change their minds, right? But that's where we've gone. So we've seen this in all jurisdictions, but in everywhere where it's been legal, you see the numbers increasing. Now there was an interesting sort of bump in the Netherlands, and I think that bump, I mean, they had 1 year where it went down a little, and then it went up again. And I think that had to do with the fact that they had a court case in the Netherlands, which created a bit of a cold, a slowing down. And that court case dealt with the woman who had asked for euthanasia when she was competent, and then she was in a nursing home. She was deemed to be incompetent, and the doctor came to do euthanasia, and she said no. She said no. And then what happened is the doctor had asked the family to hold her down as he put in the IV and everything, and she was resisting. So he first then put a sedative in her coffee. So we
Oh,
call it sort of the euthanasia coffee case because he first sedated her. But even after he put the sedative in the coffee, actually, I shouldn't say he, it was a female doctor. After she put the sedative in the coffee and the coffee was sort of drank, this woman continued to even resist.
wow.
So then the family was asked to hold her down as the woman was injected. She died, of course, of euthanasia. So that ended up going into the courts. And I think it was that case that actually created a bit of a slowing down for a year because doctors were thinking, oh, we better watch what we're doing because this is now in the courts. Maybe they're going to say that we shouldn't do certain things. I wouldn't want to be taken to the courts myself. So you see 1 year a bit of a dip, and then after that court case was decided, it went back up again. So how that court case was decided is the courts said at first that there was an error here, and in the end, that it went to it was the Supreme Court in the Netherlands, and the Supreme Court said no, it was fine because the woman had asked for euthanasia while she was competent, but at the time of killing her, she was incompetent, therefore she could not change her mind.
That's crazy.
Think about that. It's
Talk
insanity.
about lack of consent, right? You can have governments just decide they're going to kill you anyway, even when you change your mind. What was
And
really
dead people don't complain.
yeah. What was really shocking is you talking about children, babies, infants being euthanized. Obviously, there's no consent there from the child, and a child, a minor, can't even consent. The brain is not developed enough to make decisions, life changing decisions, anyway. And obviously, it's the parents making these decisions. How is that even? In what universe is this allowed? Why is this
Mm.
even
Okay.
allowed?
So you do have a road that's already paved in the fact that the Belgium changed their law in 2015. So you have a situation where you have a country that has no age limit for this. In the Netherlands, how the law works is that if you're 16 and above, you're considered to be an adult. So euthanasia is then based on being 16 and up. But between the ages of 12 and 16, euthanasia can be done. You can poison that person to death, but you need the consent of the parents. But in the Netherlands, you also have something called the Groningen Protocol. So what you had is a situation pre-legalization of euthanasia. You had a court case dealing with a child born with spina bifida. So you had a doctor, a pediatrician, who killed the child who was born with spina bifida because the parents had requested it. So that doctor put lethal poison into that child, and he said that it was necessary. He called it a force majeure, forced to do this based on A, parents wanting it, and B, he said that child was suffering. Now, we don't have to get into spina bifida. You can bring in an expert to talk about it, but I could tell you, most children today do very well with spina bifida. You don't have to talk to me, but you can bring in someone if you want to do that show on that. But anyway, the point of it is that went to the court. So this is previous to euthanasia being legalized in the Netherlands. That case happened previous to 2001. Okay, and the Supreme Court in the Netherlands said suffering is suffering is suffering. There's no what you did was fine. So after they legalized euthanasia in the Netherlands and they said age 12 was the limit, you had a protocol that was written at the Groningen University Hospital that was approved by the Dutch government in 2005. So the law says age 12, but because of the protocol being approved in 2005, you can kill a newborn based on a child born with disabilities. And the reasoning behind it is actually very wide, but obviously the parents have to consent, and they say it's all about eliminating suffering. But even if you read the Groningen Protocol, which is so, first of all, I believe this is all eugenic. Certain lives are not worth living. But just to throw this at you to see how crazy this is, it said possible future suffering was also an acceptable reason. Well, excuse me, Arena, we all have possible future suffering.
Crazy.
You don't have to have a significant disability to have possible future suffering, but that's what the Groningen Protocol says. Now, in Canada, we're talking about extending euthanasia to mature minors. I'm going to get into that in a second, but during that debate that was going on, so we had a government committee come out with a report, in 2023. So this was a government, 10 members of parliament, 5 senators sat on a committee and discussed this. And the report said that we should extend euthanasia in Canada to mature minors. Now, we haven't done it yet, but the report says we should. Okay. So that should create huge concern. But during that debate, the Quebec College of Physicians, in their presentation to the committee, said they agreed with euthanasia for mature minors, but they thought we should also have euthanasia newborns, and they described the situation of the Cronin protocol. Now, I think all of euthanasia is actually eugenic, but this is very eugenic because now you're specifically killing somebody because you deem that their life is not worth living. You might say, oh, but Alex, there's some pretty extreme cases of children born with disabilities. And, you know, I'm not going to argue that. There are some pretty extreme cases. But if this child has no chance of life, now remember, they're not actually talking about that. But even if the child had no chance of life, you would then care for that child, keep that child comfortable, and that child would die naturally. Of course, these are tragic situations, especially for the parents, right? It's very tragic for everyone. But you don't have to kill them. But they say, no, we should be killing them. But this is not limited to those cases. So let's not go into that argument because it's not limited to those cases. It's limited, it's based on the parent deciding. So now what does it mean to be a mature minor in Canada? So let's say we do extend euthanasia in Canada to mature minors. It's just been discussed, which the government committee has said we should do. How do you define a mature minor? And I think it's probably the same as in the US. A mature minor is not based on an age. It's based on an assessment. So these issues have come up through the courts over the years because you would have a situation of a treatment question, and the child might be saying no to a certain treatment, and yet that treatment is necessary for that child and has great benefit to that child. So then years ago, they've had some cases that went to the courts, and the question was, is this child capable of consenting to say no to a treatment which is of great benefit to them? Okay. And the courts decided if the child is deemed to be capable of consenting, then they must be treated like an adult. If they're not deemed to be capable of consenting, then it would be decided by usually the parent or physician, etc., as to whether that treatment would continue. So you've got this mature minor concept. So it would mean that a 13-year-old who's considered mature could die by euthanasia if we allow this. Now, what goes even further is if because they are treated like adults, remember, mature minor means they're treated like an adult, the parents would never have to know.
Mm.
Now, I'm not saying that the parents would never know. I'm just saying that parents would never have to know because of the privacy rules. If, let's say, the 13-year-old girl with cancer were to ask for euthanasia and say, I'm not telling my parents, they would only find out then when the hospital calls the family saying, what are the funeral arrangements for your daughter?
Oof.
That's when they would find out. Because if she says, I don't want them to know, you can't tell them. It's her privacy. Think about it.
That's insane. And really to say a mature minor, that's incompatible. That's an oxymoron. Scientifically, the brain doesn't finish developing until 24, 25 years of age. So there is no minor who is ever mature to
So
make a
I agree with
life-changing
you completely.
decision.
But these are very difficult questions. We're dealing with a medical treatment question, and now you have a disagreement between a patient and a doctor. So you can see where the question developed from. Not to say that I agree with what the decision was
Right.
in the end. I'm just saying you can see where it develops from, but how it would result in this is pretty disgusting. But
Mhm.
nonetheless, that is the reality. And I think you probably have similar laws in the US, similar court cases in the US. I would think that we're not outliers in Canada, that this would be very similar.
We do, especially on abortion and transgender surgeries.
Yep.
These same things, children can bypass parents in these decisions that are life changing. So it's a way for the medical establishment to get to the children, um, and to bypass parental authority. You would hope that parents aren't going to choose bad things for their children, right? Things that are like killing
Yeah.
them, right? But that's assuming too much, I guess, right? Because obviously, as you've mentioned, there are parents who have chosen that in Belgium or the Netherlands, and it's horrific to hear because that's where the government should come in to protect the life
Yeah.
of everybody, especially the most vulnerable. Children are vulnerable, so this is a very very sad conversation to have that this is actually happening or is going to go in that direction in other countries as well.
I just want to share one more thing with you, and I know we're going on, but anyway, my organization, Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, was co-founded by uh, a doctor who was a pediatric oncologist, and he's passed away quite a few years ago. And he talked about that there was only one time in his career, his name was Dr. Barry DeVeber. There was only one time in his career where he actually had a request for euthanasia. So all of his patients were cancer kids. And he said it was the parents who approached him and said, couldn't you do something to end the suffering of our child? And he said, no, I can keep your child comfortable, but I will not do anything to kill your child. And he said he walked into the room to see that child as he's the doctor, this is his patient, and the child said to him, "Did my parents just ask you to kill me?"
Wow.
So the child was well aware, and he says, "Well, yes, your parents just asked me to kill you. Yes." And he says, "Don't listen to them." That's what the patient said. Don't listen to them. I want to live. And that was the only time. And he was a pediatric oncologist for 40 years. He dealt with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of patients. And in the early years, most of those children died. He talked about how it was very difficult in his early years as a physician, that most of his patients died, and near the end of his career, almost all of his patients survived. But even in that situation where most of them he knew would die, of course, he would never kill them, but he only had one request, and that's how it went. So,
Hmm. Powerful. And imagine being that child, um, feeling my parents are actually not for me in this, not for my life. That's very
it's a
scary.
misguided mercy.
Hmm. Hmm. We talked a little bit about the U.S. and especially Oregon and California. Can you go over a little bit more about the overview of the assisted suicide laws in the U.S. and you mentioned those 13 states. Under what conditions do they allow them? Do you see a push for more legalization of assisted suicide in the other states? What's the landscape like in the US?
So, I have good news and bad news for you in the US. So, up until last year, there were 10 states that had legalized assisted suicide, death by lethal poison, and one jurisdiction, Washington, D.C. That means 11 total jurisdictions, obviously. Last year, 2025, assisted suicide laws were passed in Delaware, Illinois, and New York. Now, the New York law has not gone into place yet because of the fact that the governor of New York decided that the law was too wide, and she told them that she would not sign the bill unless the bill added in a residency requirement, because the original law bill did not have a residency requirement, meaning anybody could go to New York to die by assisted suicide. And she also wanted a 5-day waiting period or reflection period added to the law, etc. So that right now they're debating that right now at this moment. So I'm assuming that in the near future, I shouldn't say because I can always hope that they're going to defeat the whole thing off. I can hope that, and I would want that to happen. But it's likely in the near future, New York will have legalized assisted suicide too, and U.S. will be up to 13 states. And there's a big push now in quite a few states in the U.S. for 2026 and 2027. There's a big push right now. There had been no state that had legalized assisted suicide in the U.S. between 2021 and 2025. We had lots of bills. There was lots of states where they thought they were going to win the assisted suicide lobby, that they thought they were going to legalize, and they failed, and they failed, and they failed. Some states like Connecticut have had a bill pretty much every year for the last 13 years type thing, and every year they get defeated. And when I say Connecticut, that's important because that's a very left-leaning state, you should say. So what it means is that just because someone's progressive, as they would say in the political spectrum, does not mean that they will necessarily support assisted suicide, even though we know the data shows that they're more likely to support assisted suicide. Not saying they all do. So we have this sad growth that's going on, and it's very upsetting. I joined the Compassion Choices. Compassion Choices is your main assisted suicide group in the U.S. They bring in millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars a year. They're a massive corporation. It's very, very, very sad to see this. But anyway, they had their strategy meeting for 2026. It was online, and I signed up for it. I get all their emails, so I signed up for it. And they were talking about the states they're focusing on in 2026. So there's quite a few of them that they're focusing on. Nevada, for instance, Virginia, they're focusing on in a big way. Once again, Connecticut and Maryland, Massachusetts. Now they're focusing on more states than that, but those are the key states that they really hope they're going to win. I'm not. I hope they don't win any of them. Um, and I shouldn't say win, it's a loss anytime this is legalized because people are killed. They're also focusing very heavily on Florida and Arizona, even though they don't expect those states to go to legalize anytime soon. But they look at the demographics of those states and they recognize that those are states that they want to legalize assisted suicide in. So they're putting a lot of money into those states to build a team and the whole thing. So that's very concerning. But what else is going on is that they're trying to change definitions in a big way. So assisted suicide, they want it to be seen as medical treatment, end of life care. So they're working very hard and they're working with certain, and I shouldn't say this, but it's true, they're working with certain palliative care groups that have the whole concept of assisted suicide seen as just another form of palliative care. Now, palliative care, according to the World Health Organization, is something to deal with your pain and symptoms to make sure you're comfortable, but never to kill you. So if you read the World Health Organization definition of what palliative care is, it's never to kill you. But of course, there are certain leaders in palliative care, certain organizations within palliative care that have accepted assisted suicide as something that's akin to palliative care, which to me, I have to watch what I'm saying. This is a Catholic show. So I'll just say it it's destroying the concept of reality that they want it to be defined as just another form of end of life care. And they're really pushing on that in a serious way. You see it in their language, in their new bills. They refer to it as medical treatment. Once you call it medical treatment, you have this other serious problem. You have a type of a right to the knowledge of what's available to you. Give you an example. Let's say you live in Oregon. If this is medical treatment and you live in Oregon and you have a serious case of cancer, the doctor would have to then explain to you, well, this is the type of treatment we can offer you. We can offer you this and this and this. This is the most effective way, I think, for your condition, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also assisted suicide. Because if it's medical treatment, then it becomes one of the options, right? It now, of course, there's many doctors who would say, I don't believe in that, and they won't offer that. But there's many other doctors who would say, well, wait a second, this is a legal service. It's available to you. I feel I'm obligated to tell you about it. So now you're going through a difficult health condition, and the doctor's saying, oh, by the way, we can kill you. So now it becomes a sales approach to selling assisted suicide. And that's what they're really pushing for, the redefinition of what this is. It's very serious to where they're going. The other thing is they're really promoting, and I know this is very controversial, they're really promoting this whole thing about this Pachetta bill. So this is a bill that's right now being debated federally, which will provide funding for palliative care training. Now, why is that? It's because the language of the Pachetta bill actually is not distinct. It's not clear language. So they see assisted suicide as end of life care, and Pachetta is about promoting end of life care and providing funding for promoting end of life care. They see it good to have more federal funding for training because then they can promote assisted suicide. And it's all based on language. Language can kill you. Language can kill you. The other thing is they're changing the language. They're now using the term MAiD. I've already explained that MAiD is a made in Canada term. It means medical assistance in dying. But it's a confusing term on purpose. It does mean euthanasia and assisted suicide. So, the euthanasia lobby in the US, they want euthanasia. They talk about how wonderful Canada is. They want euthanasia. But if, they were to switch it from assisted suicide, where you have to take it yourself, to actually being injected by the doctor, if they were to switch it, it's a lot easier if you're already using the language of euthanasia. MAiD. MAiD is the term used in Canada. As I say, it's a false term. It's a confusing term. Because guess what? If you're getting palliative care, and real palliative care, not killer palliative care, you're getting real palliative care, that is a type of aid in dying, isn't it? So we're creating intentional confusion in the language, and that's what they're really pushing. I tell people, never use their language.
Yes.
Never use their language. This is not medical aid in dying. This is killing. This is about poisoning people to death. Talk about what it is. This is about poisoning people to death. Talk about the reality. Let's be brutally honest. In the US and Canada, we both have similar problems with the cost of healthcare, don't we? They're offering you healthcare reform. Dead people don't cost money. They're offering you healthcare reform. They want to save money. The other thing is we have an aging population. Dead people don't collect pensions. Dead people don't collect disability benefits. It's called reform of our financial system. It's called, they are trying to save money by killing people. And they say it's all about freedom, choice, and autonomy. It's not freedom of choice and autonomy when someone else is involved with killing you. It's a lie. It's a lie. It's a lie. It is about, though, killing. That's what it's about. And we have to be very clear about it. It is about poisoning someone. That's absolutely correct. Anyway, I think I've given you a pretty roundabout thing. They're pushing this is the big changes they've been pushing in the last few years, and they've accomplished in many states. They want no waiting periods. They want you to be able to have a same-day death. Obviously, you can't change your mind when you're dead. Yeah, they're trying to get rid of the 6-month prognosis issue. So if you look at these laws, a lot of the new bills talk about 12 months. What is a 12 months prognosis? What does that mean? If I get diagnosed with cancer, I'll give you an example. A friend of mine just got diagnosed. He's got some significant cancer, and he's told he has about a 12-month prognosis. Odds are he's dead within 12 months. Doesn't mean he's going to be dead in 12 months. He might live 3 or 4 years. We don't know. But the prognosis says he could be dead within 12 months. He's feels very good right now. You know, we were just talking about going traveling together. Well, he's feeling very healthy. He's fine. He knows he has his cancer, but he's not hobbling around or anything. He feels very good. So, but he could be killed if you have a 12-month prognosis. Now in Canada, we have no age limit, no prognosis limit. But you know what I'm getting to? They want to eliminate these things. They want same-day deaths. They also are expanding it in the U.S. Original laws only allow doctors to do it. They're pushing for nurses, doctor assistants, etc. Why? Because there's very few doctors willing to kill. So they realize that the problem with the number of deaths is, for them, because they want more death, is there's too few killers. So if you add to the ranks the number of people who could be killers, you're obviously going to be able to kill more people because you have more availability of people willing to kill. The other thing is conscience rights. Very big issue. They're telling you that you don't have to do the act, but you're going to have to refer. So that's the problem in Canada. I have a very good friend who was a palliative care doctor. He only did palliative care. Phenomenal guy, amazing. And he left palliative care. He's become just a pain specialist now. He has pain clinics he's opened up. He's just involved with pain. So he's dealing with athletes and things like that, and other people who might have, let's say, disability issues that they have pain. He's become a pain specialist. And why? Because he was being asked by his patients for euthanasia. And he said, I don't believe in that. But he was being told he had to refer. And he says, I'm not going to refer you to a killer. I'm not going to do that. And he's like, I don't want to be brought before the College of Physicians and Surgeons because I'm not going to refer my patients to kill them. I'm not going to do that. So he left palliative care. So what becomes of palliative care when your doctors who aren't willing to kill you have left because they want to protect their consciences? He's still an excellent physician. He's still killing pain for people. He's still dealing with patients. He's still being a phenomenal physician. He's just not being faced with all these questions for euthanasia, and he doesn't have to worry about his conscience rights as a pain specialist rather than as a palliative care doctor. And the number of doctors I know who have left palliative care in Canada alone because they were being requested and they felt they had no protection of their conscience, therefore they felt they better leave that because they did not want to be dragged before some tribunal and told you're a terrible doctor because you won't refer people to be killed. This is the kind of thing we see. So they've been pushing against that also. In the US, you are fortunate. You've had a few good decisions on conscience rights. And so doctors are at least being protected in that way. But they're being really pressured to refer to be killed. This is the kind of thing that's going on. It's insanity. It's really insanity.
It's really horrific, actually, and I think you've pinpointed so many areas. I just still can't get over the fact that they would try to push killing as a treatment option, right?
Right.
This is not, you're not saying, let's help you treat the disease. Let's just obliterate you, and then you don't exist anymore. So how is that treatment? You're actually killing that person.
Well, you've seen that with other issues, right? If you define it as treatment, then suddenly it becomes normalized. But then it also must be available. And I know we've been talking for a while, but in Canada, we have these MAiD teams now. So every major hospital in Canada has a MAiD team, euthanasia team. So what's the advantage to the MAiD team? The advantage to the MAiD team is most doctors aren't going to do it, and they don't want to refer. So if you have a MAiD team on staff there, they're the ones who then are approving the euthanasia. They're approving it. They're the ones doing it, but they're also selling it.
Hmm.
So what they're doing is they go to hospital rooms and they say to people, well, we're just making sure you know that you have the option of MAiD. Okay. I got a call from a guy in Ottawa, and he said, he's a supporter. He said, Alex, it was ridiculous. I was visiting my dad in palliative care. He was approaching death. All the families together. We all came together. We're all, spending time with dad. It was like on the weekend. And the MAiD team came into the room. And they asked him, do you want MAiD? And he said, no, I don't. I'm not interested in MAiD. Now, he's in palliative care, so he's already pretty much made his decision. He wants to die a natural death. So then he said, we all went out for a coffee. We came back to the room, like, I don't know, maybe it was an hour later. I'm not sure. He didn't tell me the exact timing. He says, we all went out for a coffee. We came back. And when we walked in the room, he said, Dad said, guess what happened as soon as you guys left the room? The MAiD team came back and asked me again. Think about it. That's not only sales, that's pushy. That is coercion. Even if it's subtle, it's coercion. And this is the kind of thing you get. I just talked about conscience rights, and I know we're moving on, but right now in Canada, there's a court case going on. But people watching this down the line, you'll know the result of that court case. So St. Paul's Hospital in Vancouver had a case in 2023 where a woman was in palliative care. She asked for euthanasia. And they said, well, we don't do that. But because she has the right to have this in law, they said, we will transfer you out. We'll transfer you out, and it'll be done somewhere else. So that's what happened. She died by euthanasia. There wasn't anything. I'm not excited about these transfer concepts, but not the point. They refused to kill her at St. Paul's Hospital. And then what happened is dying with dignity, and the family of this woman made a big deal about it. And at first they launched a whole pressure on the government to force St. Paul to do euthanasia. And then what they did is they launched a court case. So Dying with Dignity is the big euthanasia group of Canada. And this family, they went in together, launched this big court case, a charter challenge. And their argument is that because St. Paul's receives government money, and this is a legal service, they must offer euthanasia. So that case is actually being heard right now. So if you give the context, we're right now, as we're recording this, I know you may not want me to say, but we're in late January of 2026. That case is being heard right now in a Vancouver court, where the argument is by the Dying with Dignity people, you must provide euthanasia at a Catholic hospital. And of course, the Catholic healthcare, and even actually the province of British Columbia in this case, funny enough, are arguing, no, they don't have to do that. And we'll see what the judge decides. No matter what the judge decides, it will get appealed. If the judge agrees with Catholic healthcare that they don't have to do euthanasia, obviously the euthanasia lobby will appeal that to the Court of Appeal. And if we lose the case, then that would also be appealed to the Court of Appeal, and it'll end up at the Supreme Court of Canada. The point of it is that you can see where they're going. They want every single institution in Canada, every single medical institution in Canada to have euthanasia because they're receiving money from the government. And it's further than you think even. You might say, well, this isn't going to go anywhere, Alex. No. The Delta Hospice Society several years ago was a hospice group just north of Vancouver. Yeah. They refused to do euthanasia. Now, they like St. Paul's, they would transfer you if you asked for it. So I'm not excited about transfers. I don't believe in killing people, but by law, they would have to transfer them. And the Delta Hospital was literally across the street. So this was not a situation where they'd have to put you in some ambulance and drive you for 22 minutes somewhere. It was literally across the street. The government said, because you're not willing to do euthanasia, they defunded the Delta Hospice Society. They expropriated their 10-bed hospice. And now the Delta Hospice Society, that building is not the Delta Hospice Society anymore, because Delta Hospice Society still exists, but it doesn't have a in-home hospice, and it was totally defunded by the government. Anyway, that building now does euthanasia. This is the kind of thing you get. And don't tell me it's not going to happen in the US, because the fact of it is once it's legal, it expands. It always expands. And this is where you're coming from. The other thing is, once it's legal, they'll say, well, it has to be accessible. It's my right? It's my right to have. It's a legal service. It has to be accessible. So that's why they expanded and expanded and expanded. And yeah, it's a
It's
sad reality.
crazy, and I'm really glad you brought up the conscience issues because, obviously, there are so many Catholic hospitals, healthcare systems, and this directly goes against Catholic teaching. You
Right.
may never directly kill someone, and so to force a healthcare system or hospital to be involved in it, and even referral is still an indirect involvement in that, is to put undue pressure in a hospital that's built on Catholic ethics, or a healthcare system that's built on Catholic ethics. That's the way it operates, and
Right.
to
Absolutely.
force it. And it's not just with euthanasia, it's with abortion, it's with the transgender procedures. All of those things are being forced upon institutions that are follow the Hippocratic oath, which is do no harm to the human body, do no harm to that person. And these are harmful procedures that either maim or kill. So the conscience issue is a big one, especially once assisted suicide or euthanasia is legalized. And so
So
thank you for highlighting
this,
that.
this current court case actually defines whether or not there will be Catholic healthcare at all in Canada in the future.
Mm.
That's
Wow.
what it means. Yeah.
Wow. So you mentioned, obviously, I want to talk a little bit about the slippery slope.
Right.
And one, what is the slippery slope argument against euthanasia and assisted suicide? And why do critics misunderstand or dismiss it? And what's the reality of what actually happens once euthanasia and assisted suicide is legalized?
So philosophically, the other side just argues that the slippery slope is a logical fallacy. And I don't actually agree with that point at all, because if we look at the reality, in reality, when you pass certain laws, it does always lead to extensions unless it's been such a massive failure. I mean, I'm not going to get into that, but I mean, it will lead to extensions. In the case of this situation, we don't have to talk about slippery slopes. It's a logical extension. We have experience in every single jurisdiction where once it's legalized, it always expands. It just does. I don't have to talk about the numbers of deaths. I can talk about the type of deaths. When you talk about the numbers of deaths, someone from the other side would say that's just because there's demand for this service. Isn't it wonderful what we've done? Now in Canada, it's over 5% of all deaths are euthanasia. That shows you demand for the service. Isn't it good we legalized it? So that's what they would argue. But it's also the types of deaths. You wouldn't imagine that someone who is clearly not terminally ill, who has a situation where they're not capable of making decisions for themselves anymore, would be considered. Like you mentioned about the Mrs. B case, that is a case where she had asked for euthanasia, then she changed her mind, and then you get the husband who's going through all this crisis dealing with his wife and her medical condition. He then asked the MAiD team for her euthanasia. She gets approved and she dies by euthanasia. Like that's any way you look at it, that's like absolutely insane. But if you look at the government report that's reporting this, it's exactly what the report says. So you can't even say that comes from Alex Schadenberg and he's against euthanasia, so you better be pretty suspect about it. It's coming from an Ontario coroner's report, and the Ontario coroner is not against euthanasia. He's just reporting on concerning cases.
Mhm.
And of course, though that doctor was never brought before the College of Physicians and Surgeons. Anyway, so we move on. We have a history of that it always expands. And I've already explained why it expands. Like the prime example when you look at the Canadian situation is the original law said that your natural death had to be reasonably foreseeable, which was a type of terminal illness restriction. It wasn't defined, so it wasn't an effective type of terminal illness restriction anyway. Nonetheless, a Quebec court decision is what led to its expansion, because the Quebec court said, and it was challenged based on two people with disabilities arguing they did not qualify for euthanasia because they weren't terminally ill in any way, but they said that their suffering should allow them to qualify. And the Quebec judge, now let's be clear about this. The judge's name was Baudouin. She was the daughter of a euthanasia activist in Quebec.
Mm.
And after she made this decision, so I'm going to go back to the decision. After she made this decision, she was appointed to the Court of Appeal in Quebec. So she got a promotion because the government really loved her decision. Anyway, she said that,
Mm.
that's correct, that you cannot deny the legal service to someone who has a chronic condition just because they don't have a terminal condition. And that's where we get the situation in Canada now where you need to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition, which is also not defined. So these are extensions. And why they say that? It was because of inequality. It was you could not deny this to someone because of the unequal access. The argument in Canada going on right now about euthanasia by for mature minors, the one that was promoted by that government committee, they said that it was discrimination not to allow a 16, 17, 14-year-old, a mature minor, not to have access to euthanasia. It was discrimination. Well, guess what? You're right. That is discrimination. The problem is we legalized killing in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole thing about a slippery slope, remember, these laws are designed to legalize. So when you look at, well, why did they put that in the law and not this in the law? It's because they're saying, okay, today we believe that this is what needs to be in the law in order to get the legislature to vote yes. But we know that 2 or 3 years down the road, we're going to expand it. Give you another example. In the US, all the laws originally had residency requirements. Now in Oregon and Vermont, they removed the residency requirement. So what happened is Compassionate Choices launched a lawsuit in Oregon and a lawsuit in Vermont saying that it was unconstitutional to deny out-of-state residents access to a legal healthcare service. Now, it's not a healthcare service, it's killing. Nonetheless, that's how the court case was set up. And in both Oregon and Vermont, the government didn't resist them, they just changed the law.
Yeah, that's crazy, and
Okay?
that's like travel killing, right? You travel to be killed, and
Suicide tourism. That's correct.
suicide
That's exactly.
tourism,
And they
and
allow it by approvals by telehealth. So you don't
wow,
have to go to Oregon to be approved. You can have approval by telehealth and then go to Oregon to die. Think about it.
wow.
The insanity is just too much to handle. I can't
Yeah,
make this stuff up, you know.
yeah, and this is the actual what happens. So the slippery slope is demonstrably shown to be the case.
Absolutely.
So once a society accepts that some lives are eligible for death, quote unquote, how does that reshape medicine, consent, and trust in healthcare institutions?
It turns everything upside down. It literally does turn everything upside down because now when I'm going through a difficult time in my life, now death becomes an option. So at a time where I probably really do need social support, I might need counseling, I might need help because of the just accepting what's going on in my life. I might be dying, I might not be dying, but I've got a difficult health condition. I'm trying to face it. Maybe it's just the treatment that I'm having such a hard time with. Sometimes chemotherapy and things like that can be very harsh on somebody. And they're struggling and they're struggling. And then you get the whole other factor of the culture. We have a culture of loneliness. People don't realize they do actually. If you just go on this subway and look around you, you start realizing there's a lot of lonely, lonely people out there. So you take this loneliness in the culture that we have today, and then you add to it when they're going through a difficult health condition, you can understand how someone might be easily driven towards death when it's offered to them. So the other thing comes down to how it's changed other things. Legalizing euthanasia or assisted suicide has changed palliative care. Absolutely. It's changed palliative care. Now, I've already explained to you, I've had good friends who were palliative care docs who left as being palliative care docs because they just felt being pressured to refer. They weren't going to refer. I'm not going to do that. So they left because they thought I can be an excellent physician in another area, such as pain medicine, such as family medicine, such as whatever it is. I could be an excellent physician caring for my patients, but I'm not going to have to constantly face this constant situation where I'm up at night thinking, because I wouldn't refer, they're going to drag me before some tribunal. So they've left, and that means that it's been filled in. The gap is filled in with pro-death people in palliative care. But on top of it, once you start killing, it changes the concept around what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. And so what I'm going to say to you is in Canada, because palliative care institutions are obviously paid for by the government, in most provinces in Canada, those palliative care institutions are being forced to offer euthanasia. So when you go into palliative care and you're being told, well, we have A and B, or you can have MAiD, you can have euthanasia. These are your choices. Well, obviously now euthanasia is an option. So now your doctor who's to provide care for you for your pain and symptoms and keep you comfortable but not kill you is the same doctor who might kill you. And you're thinking, am I safe here? Especially someone like me. I'm not opposed to dying. I'm opposed to being killed. I'm opposed to people killing others, and I'm opposed to being killed. I don't want to be killed. If my life is coming to near an end, I'm accepting that that might happen. That's fine. I'm okay with that. I'm not okay with being killed. So now if I go to a place and I'm wondering, does the doctor wear a black hat or a white hat? I don't know. It's not like the old Western where the guy with the black hat was the bad guy and the guy with the white hat was the good guy. I don't know. It's changed everything. Then people call me up and they say, "Oh, Alex, my mother's in palliative care and this is what's going on. What do I do?" I have to say to them, "Are you able to take your mother home?" Well, that'd be very difficult in this circumstance. I got a call from someone. She was just so upset with what they were offering her. Her mother wasn't in palliative care yet, but what they were offering. And I said, "I'm going to ask you to do something which is going to be the most difficult thing you're going to do in your life." I said, "Take your mother home, ask for palliative home care. So you're caring for your mom in the home, but a nurse comes in every once in a while to make sure that if there's medications that have to be properly done and things like that, that is being properly done. Take your mother home, care for her at home." I said, "I guarantee you it's going to be difficult, but I guarantee you it's going to be fulfilling and your mother will die a natural death and it's the best thing you can do." And you would say, why should I have to say that to someone in the year 2025, 2026? Because some places I don't feel comfortable in anymore. We've lost trust. They'll kill you. I was just at a talk the other night. I'm giving a talk. At the end of the talk, I'm taking all these questions, whatever. And then at the end of all that, I'm standing at the back and these people are talking to me. And this one woman comes up to me, she says, and this is actually a Christian church. So, this woman comes up to me, she says, "Alex, I'm a nurse. And one of the nurse practitioners in my nursing group does MAiD,
Hmm.
does MAiD. And he gets so excited when there's a MAiD scheduled, a
Oof.
euthanasia schedule. He gets so excited. He's told me over and over, "Oh, you got to come with me. This is such a wonderful situation." She says he plays his rock and roll music. He's dancing around as he's getting ready to go out for doing his MAiD. And she says, "This is insane." And I said, "That's exactly it. It's insane because he's become now addicted to killing." And now let's say you're in that same situation. He's your nurse. Do you not think he's going to be saying to you, "Well, in your condition, probably the best thing for you is MAiD. Oh, it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful if it would kill you." Like, that's what you get. Everything is upside down.
Yeah.
And there's nothing good you can say about any of it. It's crazy. It's crazy.
It actually corrupts medicine. And as you mentioned, how can you trust that true palliative care, which is about having a comfortable end of your life, a natural death, a comfortable death where you are just given pain medications. How do you know?
Sure.
As you mentioned, people leave the palliative care industry because they don't want to be part of euthanasia or assisted suicide. And then who's left behind? Those who are for it. So they'll push for it. And that's a very scary reality.
That's
When
exactly
you
what's
push
happened.
people out who actually have consciences, when you push them out of the healthcare field, who do you have left? And do you actually can you actually trust the people who are left behind with your life, with your healthcare? And that's questionable. We're nearing the end of our interview. It's been phenomenal. I wanted to talk a little bit about how much of euthanasia and assisted suicide culture is driven by judging a person's value based on their usefulness. How much of it is also based on a false sense of compassion or fear of being a burden?
So this is where the disability community is absolutely correct. That there's already a eugenic attitude within the culture, meaning that people look at someone who has significant disabilities or even, um, you know, difficult health conditions like a chronic condition, and people would think, "Oh, I wouldn't want to be like that." And that might be a normal human reaction in one sense, but in fact, it's very eugenic because we actually start thinking, "I not only wouldn't want to be like that, I would rather be dead." And so now you legalize euthanasia, and now you're thinking, well, can we assume that that person is receiving the proper health care that they need? And the answer is often no. Not that everyone's a terrible person, but you get such a situation where they're seen so differently. So the concept of then, well, you're qualified to be killed, then comes into that. And then you get situations where some people are saying, I'm going to struggle to receive the care that I need or the treatment that I might need for my condition. But you can kill me by MAiD tomorrow? And this is the reality that goes on. So you can see how this whole degeneration of attitude towards the individual and the equality of the human person really undermines our ability to live. And then you start thinking about, oh, but that seems pretty extreme. It's not pretty extreme. It's actually, sadly, a part of the human person. So I mentioned about eugenics earlier. I'm very sad about the fact that, yes, eugenics, okay, I'm happy that eugenics has changed. I'm sad at the same time because we don't understand that the culture is deep into eugenics. And it's not like World War II, where the Nazis would drag you out and kill you because you had a disability or you were Jewish. As terrible and horrific as that is, it's now all attitudes. It's attitudes. So we've been conditioned to believe that is not the way to live. That is eugenic. So it's so ingrained in us. So we're going to go off topic for 1 second. Most late-term abortion is because that child has a disability. The Quebec College of Physicians said we should allow euthanasia of newborns. Why? Because that child is born with a disability. They're better off dead. When someone's going to the doctor and then they have significant health conditions, and someone's saying, and the doctor's saying, "Have you thought about medical aid in dying? It's so peaceful." What is he saying? You're better off dead.
Mm.
So much so that we're going to kill you. Oh, we're going to dress it up. We're going to make it look beautiful. But what's the innate idea about it is that we're better to kill you than to care for you. This is sad. This is very sad. Now you mix that in with the cultural milieu. I mentioned about loneliness. There are so many people. Just if you think about the breakdown of the family. And the other thing is, if you look at one other factor, the number of people who live in single person homes today compared to 50 years ago, it's totally the opposite now. It used to be most people at least lived within some familiar housing situation where they had either they were living with their parents or they were married or whatever it might be. Like there's some familiar housing or they might live with if they weren't married, they might live with a brother or sister or whatever, right? And today there's so many people living alone and they're lonely and they're culturally lonely, they're personally lonely. And then you add a health condition into the situation. And let's say they have a disability. So now they have a disability. So you're like the woman with MCS, multiple chemical sensitivities. She's living in this social housing unit and she can't even leave her apartment. And what do they offer her? Do they offer her a nice, small, single home so she can live away from all that chemical effect on her so she can at least live a reasonable life? No, she's given euthanasia. We're going to justify killing her. Was she suffering? Well, of course she was suffering. Of course I'm not saying she wasn't suffering. What is the answer? Death? Like the insanity's gone beyond. Is this eugenic? How could you ever kill someone like that? Look at who died. I've mentioned Kiano several times. Just died on December 30th. He has blood sugar issues, so he has to take insulin. Okay. He's got some blindness. He's not completely blind, but I mean he's got blindness. Well, that's affected by his diabetes. He's got a bit of neuropathy, but actually his mother says it's not an issue, but of course he used that as an issue because he wanted to die. He's clearly going through mental health issues. He wants to die, and that was something he could use because he had to tell the doctor, I'm suffering. But what did the doctor decide? You understand he's going through mental health issues, so you might see, you might understand him quite wanting to die because his deep desire to die because of his mental health driving him towards that. And he needs treatment, but you can understand where he's coming from, even though he needs treatment. You wouldn't kill him, but she's saying, yeah, you're better off dead. I'll kill you. Come on.
Mm.
It's just beyond. And you say, well, most people, that's not the case. Okay, so for the sake of the few white people who are highly educated and wealthy, we should allow a total change in our medical system and deny everyone else the ability to be properly cared for. I
Mm.
think about it. And plus, once you start killing, you can't control it anyway. Once you say it's okay to kill, Arena, what are we debating now? We're debating who does the killing and for what reason? That's all we're debating. So you say, oh, well, Oregon's not like Canada. Well, you're right, Oregon's not like Canada, but they're going to be there someday if they keep on this track. Because if it's okay to kill, why not kill so and so? Why not? How can you justify that? If it's okay to kill Kiano, who's 26, with diabetes, some blindness, and a bit of neuropathy, if it's okay to kill him, why can't you kill somebody else? Like, honestly, they start thinking that we're just debating who kills, who's going to do the killing, and for what reason. That's all we're debating. Well, that's pretty sick. It's pretty sick. And it is about
Absolutely.
poisoning these people to death. It's all pretty sick.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what is the single most important ethical question you wish policymakers, physicians, and listeners would slow down and seriously confront?
It's ever okay to kill somebody. Come on. And even go further to that. Can you ever have a situation where you think it's reasonable to give doctors or nurses the right and law to kill you? Because that's what they're actually doing. When you look at the legislation, they actually are giving them the right and law to kill you. And you start thinking about that. I know we dress it up about, oh, this person is suffering. Okay, can't we deal with the suffering without killing? Like, honestly, but this is what it's about. And they miss it. They say, oh, but Mrs. So and so was suffering so greatly. We're providing her relief from her suffering. No, you're killing her. Is it ever okay to kill? Because that's what's happening. It's not suicide when someone else kills you. And it's not suicide when someone else is directly involved with killing you, such as assisted suicide. It is more closer than to a type of second degree murder or manslaughter when someone's directly involved in it like that. It's not the same, even though it is a type of suicide in itself, assisted suicide. Is
Hmm.
it ever okay to kill? I don't think it's ever okay to kill.
Right. Absolutely not.
And I don't feel
This,
safe in a country or in a jurisdiction that can kill me. I don't feel safe. Sorry.
yeah. I want to end on a hopeful note here. Despite everything you've witnessed, what gives you hope? And what can ordinary people do right now to protect vulnerable people from euthanasia and assisted suicide? And the follow up question, too, is what can ordinary people do to help everyone in their life, in their circle, fight that culture of loneliness and isolation that I think drives this, push for a culture of death?
Euthanasia Prevention Coalition quite a few years ago got involved with helping to start a separate corporation called Compassionate Community Care. It's an independent organization. It's a charitable organization, and the work it does is to be involved with training people to visit. What was noticed was that there's a lot of loneliness in the culture, and one of the reasons is even in church communities or faith communities or even small towns where there tended to be more of a interconnectedness within that culture, you have a situation where we've gone away from being interconnected. So we needed to be involved with training people to do visiting. And so they're doing multiple training sessions constantly for helping people have the skills to visit, because loneliness and significant health conditions really is what's precipitating a big push for euthanasia. People feel they have no reason for living. They've lost hope, purpose. The other thing Compassionate Community Care does is it's involved with advocacy. A lot of people become advocates for their parents or maybe a close friend of theirs. So let's say, my mother's 85 and she's actually reasonably good, but I mean, let's say she was visiting the doctor. I would be happy to go with her. But we provide, or Compassionate Community Care, that is, provides advocacy training so you know exactly how to deal with the doctor, so you are effective in communicating with them, so you can help get mom or dad or your good friend or someone you know from your community who needs help with that, who needs advocacy. You can help them get the services they need and the help they need and not be killed. Another thing is this calling service they've started. They've started a calling service. They've got a whole bunch of people now involved with calling people. So there's a large number of people who've now become involved with being called. So people are saying, well, my mom lives in Ottawa. She had 4 kids, but there's no family in Ottawa. They've all moved away. Someone's in Toronto, someone's in New York, someone is wherever. Nobody's in Ottawa. And mom does have her friends, but now she can't get out anymore. Can you call my mom? So the calling program calls her regularly and
Mhm.
will speak to her mom just to be a friend, just to be a friend. They also have a service for people calling who have health issues to discuss it, to help them find better answers than being killed. So they're involved with that also. The biggest thing you can do is you can recognize You have friends and you have family. You know people in your communities who might be going through a very difficult health condition and they need you. You are made to be interdependent. It's shocking when we talk about, you know, it's my body, my choice. The culture is all about independence. I can do what I want. And guess what? You weren't created to be an independent creature. You were created to be within a family, within a community. You're happiest when you're with others. So when you recognize someone else is going through a difficult time, you should be their friend. You should be with them. I got a call from a woman who wanted euthanasia. Someone gave her the number. She called us up, and I was talking to her. She had multiple health issues, and I was talking to her. And this was in the middle of winter several years ago. I mean, literally, it was like freezing outside, and she had problems with walking and everything. And she was just saying, I want to die. And I spent a lot of time just listening to her, let her express herself, let her talk. And I listened and I listened. And at the end of that, I said, I understand completely. You're in an apartment. You can't go anywhere. People aren't visiting you. You're in a situation, you're having a hard time. You can't go and even get groceries with your health conditions. You're in a very difficult situation. I understand completely. But I want you to know spring is coming. I said, your spring is coming. I said, so here's my cell phone number. Please write it down. You can call me any time you want. Please call me anytime you want. Me personally, not the helpline. Call me personally. And she called several times. I said, but spring is coming. And when spring comes, do you have a walker? You have a couple friends that might help you so you can go out. I said, once you can get some fresh air, you'll feel so much better. I said, but it's tough right now. I get it. I get it. I said, call me. She calls me then January of last year. And she says, Alex, do you remember me? I said, of course I remember you. Of course I do. Like we talked several times. I said to her, so what's up? She says, well, a woman on the floor of my apartment building has been approved for euthanasia. I want to talk her out of it. This is the same woman who originally called me saying, I want to die. She's saying, what do I do? So I spoke to her a little bit, but I said, your friend, the woman, she needs a friend. Really, what she needs more than anything else is someone who actually cares about her. Go visit her, go talk to her, explain to her this is just such a bad idea to get a doctor to kill you, and that you're willing to be with her, spend time with her. You're willing to be her friend, a significant other in her life. I don't know what ended up happening in the end. She didn't call me back as to whether that woman changed her mind or not. I don't know. But what I know is this was the same woman who wanted to die, and now she was wanting to help somebody else.
Mhm.
It's because someone cared. And that's what's missing in the culture today. We've become individualistic. Well, guess what? I was not created to be an individual. I was created to be within a family. I was created to be interdependent. And we need to remember that, what it means to be human. We've lost our human nature because we're about killing, sadly. We've lost that interdependence, you're part of my life. We've lost that because we've become individualistic. And even people who are caring and of goodwill have lost that, not because they meant to, but because the culture shifted. They need to re-grab that back and say, no, I realize that as a human being, not only am I happier, but they're happier. I need you and you need me. But instead we offer killing. Yeah, you're right. People who are dead aren't lonely. People who are dead don't cost us money in healthcare. People who are dead don't collect pensions. All those things are true, absolutely. But why did we kill them? Oh, it was all about compassion. No, it was about abandonment. That's what it was about. We abandoned them and we killed them. That's what we did. Call it what you want. That's what it is.
Alex, this has been so helpful and so thought provoking. And we are so grateful for all of the work that you have done to protect human life, especially in these tough situations where someone's facing an illness, disability, whatever the case may be. And you've been such an amazing advocate for life and for the protection of that life and every single life. So thank you for all your work. And we'll surely have you back on the show.
Thank you, Arena.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Bioethics Babe podcast. If you've enjoyed this content, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and your favorite podcast platform, and share with your friends and family. Also check out bioethicsbabe.com for the latest episodes and resources.